Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. This is a story about what if Deku became Eraserhead Part 2. If you guys enjoy this what if and want to see Part 3, comment down below and let me know before I start. Please do support for more awesome content. And leave a like and don't forget to subscribe to my channel and also share this video with your friends and check out the description in my playlist. The author of the story apprentice of InsomNyaC from 𝐴3. So let's start the video. There are not many times that 𝐬𝐻𝐸 wished he could interact directly with the 8th holder of his quirk, but over the last decade he had longed for the ability more and more. His non-existent stomach had churned at the disdain that All Might had felt for his hidden nephews. As he had focused in on his brother over the doctor, who was the current active threat, as his own brother turned his full attention from trying to steal back One for All and focused on revenge for the children he had been robbed of. Revenge for his nephews that had been created and culled with no regard for their humanity. For not being like his brother. Revenge for the one son he had recovered that the doctor had discarded as faulty, that went on to inherit All for One himself. His brother's death was a Pyrrhic victory. While it was something he had long hoped for, just so the game of cat and mouse ended, it had come at the cost of destroying his brother's family. As 𝐴 had been more than happy to point out, 𝐸 had been more than happy ignoring the fight between All Might and All for One, but now, if 𝐴 had not been lying, 𝐸 was an alternate ninth. He carried One for All himself alongside All for One, brother quirks reunited in one holder. 𝐬𝐻𝐸 had to wonder if he had vestiges too. Was there another 𝐬𝐻𝐸? One who had helped raise 𝐸 up as 𝐬𝐻𝐸 helplessly gave the power to All Might to tear him down. Was that 𝐬𝐻𝐸 happy? One for All could not transfer unless he himself allowed it, so if it was true, his alternate self had seen something in 𝐸 that he had approved of strongly enough to look past the boy with his own face and 𝐴's eyes. He wondered if the other him wondered about himself. 𝐬𝐻𝐸 loved his nephew dearly, but sometimes the man was too much like his brother for his own good. Too much like himself. His nephew flirted with danger far more often than he liked. For example, 𝐜𝐡𝐢 was more than capable of avoiding ever having to talk with All Might, and yet, every chance he saw the taller blonde, he immediately approached him to at least say hello. It was nerve-wracking at the best of times, and only made worse by Chisaki's running commentary of complaints of how easy it would be for either of them to catch the other off guard and kill the other, only to be reminded of danger sense before he would brag about how his own quirk would be perfect for the job of ending All Might before he could react. 𝐬𝐻's heart sank with the rest of them as 𝐜𝐡𝐢 privately spoke to Chisaki to inform him that yes, he was well aware of that fact and to stop trying to tempt him to do so until after Izuku got the other man's quirk. When 𝐜𝐡𝐢 had been confronted about the fact, he said he was tempted. This All Might is ultimately my enemy, as much as that hurts to admit. It wouldn't be logical to pretend that I am not going to have to kill him eventually if One for All doesn't burn out in him like it did in our timeline. Every second I spend with him casually is not only dangerous for me, but is helping lower his guard so we don't get hurt if it comes down to it. That night was spent with Nana crying for both her son and nephew in all but blood. The next day Chisaki was no longer Chisaki but Kai for 𝐜𝐡𝐢. Kai hated 𝐸 for stealing him from himself. Still, he did have to admit, he appreciated the man's creativity with his quirk. It was also not that bad being a ghost. No one could touch him like this but the small group of ghosts tied to the quirks that 𝐸 held and 𝐸 himself. It got even better with the revelation that, as touch-happy as all of them were with one another, almost none of them had any desire to be so with himself. It was ... nice. With the exception of the one time that Banjo had nearly attacked him, Kai had not broken out in hives in ages. For the first time that he could remember, he felt relaxed. So what if his new host wasn't so fastidious with his cleaning and grooming habits? It wasn't like Kai himself would get sick from it. And if his host did, what did he care? It was karma as far as he was concerned. So as time passed, he began to relax, began to accept this new strange not life for what it was. He was stuck with these people for the foreseeable future, so he had to admit, antagonizing them had been a poor decision. After about a year of good behavior, he was rewarded with a proper explanation as to why his new host and the other ghosts had been naturally included to hostility towards himself. Access to their host's memories while he dreamt under the careful watch of the man's apparent biological uncle. He decided after the fact that they were all fucking hypocrites. Okay, sure, he really hurt some kids in the other timeline and killed the guy's friend Sir Night-Eye, but here was the thing. He was younger than the man's little brother had been during the fight. After promptly calling them out on that fact, abruptly, every one of them seemed to make an effort to be nicer to him with varying degrees of effectiveness. He could tell that in the end, it had been less about the age of the kids and more the fact he had hurt his host's people. That he couldn't care less about what happened to the world as a whole so long as those he deemed important to protect were safe. A mindset echoed by most of the other ghosts. It made sense to Kai. Of course it did with his own background. Family came first and he had hurt the man's family. Fine, he could accept that. The three eldest ghosts chronologically seemed to mirror that mindset from their history, having lived through war, and given that Midoriya was actually the legitimate legal nephew of two of them and honorary one of the third, hostility was expected from them, as did the one woman of their group who, as a mother, was torn by her love for her living family and her love for their host that she viewed as just as much part of that as the son of her closest friend. That conflict unfortunately had not transferred over to Kai. He had only ever fallen on the other side of the equation for her, so she seemed at best indifferent to him and at worst hostile. Banjo was just an asshole who couldn't give a shit about his age and was just looking for an excuse to fight someone. He was an underground hero to the bone and knew what was fair and socially acceptable sometimes really didn't matter if you wanted to survive. The reason he had attacked Kai had purely been a preventive measure to keep him from trying shit while he was still slightly in shock and angry enough at everything to not be above trying to fight God. He liked to pretend at times that Midoriya 𝐬𝐴 was not exactly that for them at this point. It had worked, and outside of his insistence on trying to touch Kai all the time, he was one of the nicer ones. That left the fourth and sixth, Shinomori and En. The first of those two was easier to understand. Shinomori, holding the dubious title as the eldest physically, just didn't care about most things. The guy had been a hermit in life and, well, that was sort of obvious from how he acted. Sure, he did generally hang out with Banjo, but that was less him being social and more him putting his pet extrovert between him and everyone else. As such, it was clear he couldn't care less about Kai, so they just more or less mutually ignored one another when they found themselves in each other's proximity. And however, he was strange, even by this group's standard. He was really the only one to have ever attempted to be genuinely nice to him and not the fake nice that Banjo tried to play off as friendly. He also, up until Kai had been taken, had been the youngest physically. He was only 19, which, while not that much younger than some of the others, in combination with the fact that those others had been dead far longer, well, he seemed happy to no longer be stuck as the youngest anymore. He also seemed just happy to vibe with Kai, standing back to watch the chaos, and, at times, reminded him of Hari. He missed him. Ei. Kai was so completely done with the boss and Kurono treating him like he was made of fucking glass. He was a grown man in his 20s now. Not the same hurt kid that Ten had attacked. He had a goddamn doctorate in organic chemistry and could kill a man more ways than he could even count at this point. Okay, sure, he was completely quirkless now, but frankly he was happier this way. He was pure, untainted with the hero sickness. He was leaving to where he would be actually appreciated. He just had to sneak out to the airport to meet the man who had approached him with an offer of sanctuary. Someone who, like he himself once had, wished for a world rid of the plague that was quirks. Someone more than happy to help fund his own quest to find a cure for the disease, longing for it for himself. Fleck turn. 𝐸𝐸. Frowned as he read the report his father had handed to him courtesy of Jiren. Chisaki had snuck out of the country in the company of the leader of 𝐷𝐸𝐻. He was not sure if he should consider this a very good or very bad thing. Well, at least he would not be able to create his quirk erasing bullets this time unless he found a substitute for Iri's DNA and a way to create them without his quirk. Perhaps they would keep each other distracted long enough that they wouldn't ever really be an issue. His son was dead. Hisashi felt the air nearly be knocked from his newly restored lungs at the sight that met him when he had arrived after finishing off the top two heroes and those who had tried to help them. Tamura had evidently done an excellent job of holding his own against One for All and all of the Nine's allies, but it had been for naught, it seemed, from how his successor's body was ripping itself apart. Bodies littered the ground around the crashed battle arena, but only one held his focus, cradled in the arms of a broken man. The pro-hero Eraserhead lifted his head from where it had been bowed over the now faceless form of his student, of Hisashi's own son. His heart constricted as the truth of the matter hit him. Unlike Yoichi, who had died at his husband's hand, his son had died at his own. Because he had forgotten. Because he had allowed himself to forget. When he had awoken after his fight with All Might that he had been so certain had killed him, it had been with a several-decade-long hole in his recent memories. The last thing he had remembered was a verbal spare he had with a cute young hero who had taken his younger brother as a role model, who had been calling him out for stalking him. Gran Torino. A man who no longer was the annoyance that had worked beside the woman who eventually became the seventh and trained her successors, but his former husband who was willing to look the other way with his life of crime back when he was under the illusion he was merely a long-lived vigilante who had been excited to meet someone who had seen his late brother as being as great as he had. The doctor had buried that truth, buried the truth of his current marriage, had kept money flowing to his wife and son, faked sporadic email exchanges, all to keep his wife from trying to divorce him. To keep him in the dark. In his absence, his quirkless son had met his hero and inherited his uncle's quirk. In his damaged state, he believed the lie that the doctor fed him of a backup plan if the fighting had gone awry. One that had him giving Tamura his own copy of his quirk to try and consume his mind to take a new body, with the hopes that Tamura's twisted hate would give him the willpower to rip One for All from its new host and himself replacing it with the copy he had commissioned for his little Izuku. Eraserhead weakly flashed his broken quirk at him as he approached. The fire in the man's remaining eye reminded him so much of 𝐻𝐻𝐸, of 𝐍𝐴. Good, he could work with that. Aizawa shouted, I would like to offer you a deal. Ei. When 𝐲𝐴 opened his eyes to All Might seemingly panicking over him, as he lay on the ground with a horrible taste in his mouth, he knew immediately that something had gone wrong with the quirk that All for One had used on him. What followed was the strangest conversation with the hero he had ever had as he mentally tried to juggle his own memories with the ones that seemed to be rushing back to him of another life, of being his problem child. As he was reeling from that sort of shock and the fact that evidently his problem child had been attacked in this clearly already divergent timeline, he managed to jar some common sense back into his now former colleague to take him to get looked at in a hospital. Interestingly, his first emergency contact in his list was apparently himself, or this strange alternate version of himself. Who was Midoriya's? No, his own older brother. This was rather confusing, and the headache he had from possible hypoxia wasn't helping. Thankfully, when his alternate counterpart showed up, he managed to shoo the loud blonde from his hospital room as he underwent a nebulizer treatment. His alternate seemed to give him a puzzled look for a moment before he spoke. Does the name Eri mean anything to you? 𝐲𝐴 narrowed his eyes at the man. That depends. What does it mean to you? The man snorted and fell into the chair with an amused grin that he himself had never worn but a part of himself recognized as being common for his older brother. Just going to take a stab in the dark and ask, you are the real Aizawa-sensei? Huh. 𝐲𝐴 blinked. Problem child. It was weird seeing his own former face light up like that in a grin that he could easily recognize as Midori. Oh God, all this time he laughed. All this time, we thought I just overwrote your younger self, but in actuality he fucking swapped us. He being all for one. 𝐲𝐴 watched problem child shrug. Yeah, Dad. He figured out a while back about the fact that he had sent my consciousness back, but I might have neglected to mention that I ended up in the wrong body. He was already struggling to deal with the loss of most of our older brothers without ever having known about them, so I was unsure how well he would have taken his youngest overriding his other son. 𝐲𝐴 rubbed his face. I can only assume that you've been busy in my absence from my conflicting memories. Problem child winced slightly. Shit, I just realized how weird all this is probably. I only had to deal with 4 extra years from you while you are dealing with 14 and major historical changes from your perspective. Sorry, 𝐲𝐴 frowned. Why did you wake up so much earlier? Did he not explain how the quirk New Game Plus works? It resets the target back to the point of their quirk awakening. He paused. I guess even if the transfer of One for All hasn't happened yet, the fact that All Might came into contact with you having made his decision to name you his successor was enough to count. And I assume that there is likely no way for us to get back into our proper bodies. Problem child visibly recoiled at that idea. Sensei, I have been Midoriya 𝐲𝐴 for far longer than I was ever Midoriya Izuku. As far as I am concerned, this is my proper body. Besides, even if we did somehow switch, this body is not yours either any more than your current one. If anything, that body is more your own at this point. This body has scars that I know yours would not have had and likely lacks others, while your body would be the same for me. 𝐲𝐴 really couldn't fault the other's logic in that. Still, his heart sunk at the additional loss. He had assumed that he would be able to eventually settle back into his old life after completing the necessary course corrections to the timeline. Suddenly, a few new memories slotted into place as he thought of the loss of his small little family. While I am extremely happy that you saved Oboro from his previous fate, did you really have to steal my husband too? Problem child just laughed. I think Hisashi is a bit too old for you now. Besides, it's not my fault we have similar tastes in men. Suddenly your relationship with Bakugo and Todoroki has been recontextualized and somehow makes even less sense. Another memory clicked, earning him a sharp inhale of breath. Wait, please tell me that Bakugo never told you to go jump off a roof in the last timeline. Problem child, you know he should probably start to make an effort to try and stick to thinking of him as 𝐲𝐴 as Izuku was used to. And probably try and think of himself as Midoriya Izuku since he was going to have to get used to responding to that name solely. The other 𝐲𝐴 just averted his gaze. A lot happened that day. More than what happened to you given my actions lead to All Might picking you as his successor without having to force you to prove yourself as a true hero like I had. Frankly, by the end of it, I had largely forgotten that he even said that. I actually had completely forgotten by the time I started at UA the first time round. I only remember it now because you mentioned it. It just never really mattered. 𝐲𝐴 Izuku felt sick as his memories began to interweave, and it began to get harder to distinguish thoughts and feelings on certain events as the two sides of him began to blur together. 𝐲𝐴, it still matters because the fact he even ever thought saying something like that was okay recontextualizes a lot of his behavior. 𝐲𝐴 smiled a bittersweet smile at the use of his name. I know, which is why when he only gains villain points on the practical of the entrance exam I am going to use it as a red flag. You know how hard that is to do. Frankly, I am surprised that you didn't catch that yourself. Izuku sighed. I almost never watched the practical exams, or paid the final scores much mind given the clear bias in it. That is what the quirk assessment test was always for. Since everyone is graded for a combination of physical fitness, quirk use, and how seriously they are taking things, it is generally fair. I wouldn't have scored you so low had you just made me aware that you were a late bloomer. I wouldn't have given a shit about how late you were or how weird it was, since it would have explained your complete lack of any sort of quirk control, and I would have tossed you in remedial quirk control lessons and had you sit out most of practical early heroics classes to get you caught up with your classmates. I highly doubt you would have broken your bones anywhere near as often otherwise. 𝐲𝐸 winced but nodded along. Yeah, I sort of figured that out myself when I started teaching, since I can't exactly watch the practical test after what happened during mine. I have no idea how 𝗂𝐸 has been managing it since he took over for practical heroics. I suppose he is probably looking forward to shifting that onto All Might at the first opportunity as the senior teacher. Izuku frowned. How is that even going to work? 𝐲𝐸 shrugged. Netsu was able to talk him around to merely being a teaching assistant, since he has literally no experience with teaching before. What else have you changed besides the blatantly obvious? 𝐲𝐸 seemed to have to think about that. Well, for starters, I don't know if you have heard of the new sidekick at 𝐴𝐸 Star Racer yet, but that is what happened to Tamura. Dad swapped his decay with air walk before it manifested, and that sure led to some major changes on that front. He is still a complete gamer nerd, but he is a nice enough kid when he didn't grow up being mentally intentionally fucked up. Chisaki is quirkless now and fled the country a couple years back now, with Fleck turned to go get adopted by that cult. The doctor has fully gone rogue and we have no idea what he is up to. I finally found 9 after he tried to kill me following his friend Mummy's death, since as the hero who reported the body, I was their lead suspect as to who killed him. Oh, and I have a copy of All for One, so All Might is running around convinced I am the next Bujaman, despite the fact I literally have only ever stolen Overhaul and I suppose in a way Erasure. The rest of my quirks are just the ones from One for All. Izuku huffed and fell back into his pillow. Joy, that mess is something to look forward to. Can't I convince you to just give me Erasure back? 𝐲𝐸 snorted. I am pretty sure All Might would notice that. I hope I don't have to explain why that would be bad if he does, right? Izuku rubbed at his face but nodded. Yeah, so there is no way I am getting my quirk back. Not yet anyways. If we find the doctor, we would find his notes on how he duplicates quirks. With that we should be able to make you a shiny new copy of Erasure. One that should be vestige-free, since I am sure you would rather not have a potential copy of me in your head. Trust me, it is noisy enough with just the ones from One for All. Suddenly his head jerked forward slightly as if he had been hit from behind, making him spin in his seat to swat at empty air. Izuku blinked as it clicked what had just happened. Did one of the vestiges just hit you? 𝐲𝐸 rubbed the back of his head. Uncle Yoichi took offense to that. Don't worry, he didn't mean any real harm by it. If he had, he would have triggered danger sense and I would have been able to dodge it. Izuku gave a reluctant nod to that. If you say so. What is the plan now anyways? Are we going to tell All for One about the mix-up? 𝐲𝐸 seemed to consider that. Ultimately, that would be up to you, but personally I would advise against it, since in the long run at this point, what does it matter? I think it would be best to tell him that you also got sent back alongside me though, since both he and Mom are going to notice the personality change. That could be explained away just with the whole remembering the shit alternate future though, and as for everyone else, well, today was a pretty shitty day for you even before you woke back up. 𝐸𝐸𝐸. ended up walking his slightly dazed younger brother home. Actually, they were technically twins now, weren't they? They both had memories for the same number of years elapsed at least. Well, he would still think of himself as the older brother between them. He was physically older in this timeline, and it was only a matter of time before he had been 𝐲𝐸 for longer than Izuku had been originally. Just over 2 years. Their mother opened the door for them as Izuku was struggling with the key in his current state. 𝐲𝐸, what a pleasant surprise. To what do we owe the pleasure of you dropping by for a visit? 𝐲𝐸 looked past her into the apartment. Is Dad here? She shook her head. Though he went out to run down to the grocery store to pick up more eggs and a few other things. He should be back here soon. Why do you ask? 𝐲𝐸 gently pushed Izuku over the threshold and walked in himself. Izuku got caught up in a villain attack earlier. He is fine but still kind of out of it from the shock of nearly drowning and meeting All Might in person for the first time over the span of a couple minutes. I might have changed Izuku's first official listed emergency contact to myself for obvious reasons. Before he could even finish, their mother was busy fretting over Izuku, who had woken up enough from his slight daze to begin familiar protest. Mom, I'm okay. I got looked over by the doctors already. I am pretty sure suffocating me in a hug is pretty counterproductive for someone who just nearly drowned. 𝐲𝐸 was happy to see that despite his younger brother's protests, that likely largely came from the man that was his former teacher, he still was quite happily snuggling into their mother's arms with proper Midoriya tears in his eyes. While he was still uncertain how to feel about his younger brother suddenly gaining all the memories of his former sensei, He was glad that whoever Izuku settled as, he was clearly not planning on fighting their mother's affection. Of course, knowing that the man had likely grown up alone on the streets like himself, perhaps the temptation of having a normal childhood at least in some part was stronger than his desire to be treated like his actual age. God knows that there had been times that he had missed his old life growing up, and he knew that this Izuku had had an even better one than himself thanks to his own meddling. He couldn't help but think that perhaps the reason that he wasn't really fighting the new status quo was the depression that he had long suspected his teacher had suffered from, that he himself now feigned in his hero persona. He would have to keep an eye on that. It had barely been a week since he had walked through the doors of the hospital the last time. A week since Izuku woke up. From the outside, it was as if his younger brother's mask had shattered as he became even more quiet and reserved than he had been boxed into being. He was barely talking, mourning the losses of those he had loved in the previous timeline. It was bad enough that 𝐲𝐸 and their father had been forced to sit down with their mother and explain the situation of the previous timeline. One that Izuku now remembered, how the panic attack that 𝐲𝐸 had suffered when they first met had been because he was genuinely panicking at the sight of the man responsible at least in part for his death. Izuku, who was the only one who had memories of how it actually happened that they were sent back, elaborated on how their father, with zero memories of them or anyone else that he cared about, went completely off the deep end and only clawed himself back out after the damage to his brain had been rewound. A way to find Izuku mourning over the loss of 𝐲𝐸 and offered to send him back to save everyone from himself for another chance with his family, a feat that 𝐲𝐸, despite not having received the request himself, had more than fulfilled. Sure, they had no idea where the man who had twisted their father into such a state was, but given that their father was there and in one piece and he had stepped fully back from villainy for now, they were fully confident that the doomed future they had come from would not happen. Their mother, for obvious reasons, had not been pleased and had banished him to the couch for the foreseeable future. All for one had of course been reasonably ecstatic by that reaction. It made sense though when you considered the last time a revelation of that nature had happened with his spouse. He had been pretty much immediately divorced for it. 𝐲𝐸 was eventually able to get his mother to admit she had been suspicious that something was up with her husband villain-wise from basically the beginning, but loved him anyway. Besides, she wasn't going to hold him accountable for something he did in another timeline that literally only 2 people remembered when those said 2 people were willing to forgive him for it. Why did all this matter? Because, in the wake of everything, Izuku had pulled 𝐲𝐸 to the side and told him point blank he needed to find Shinso Hitoshi. Apparently, in the previous timeline, he had found the boy in rough shape by chance on one of his patrols, and he and Hisashi had eventually adopted him as their son. The fact that 𝐲𝐸 hadn't yet worried Izuku, and now 𝐲𝐸 as well. It had taken a few days to find him, and even actively looking for him, he nearly missed Shinso. If it hadn't been for the faint smear of blood, he wasn't sure he wouldn't have passed right by him. The skeletal form of the lavender-haired boy was frozen, holding his breath squeezed back between a dumpster and a wall. 𝐲𝐸's eyes met a pair of violet lanterns as the boy suddenly tried to shove himself even further back in a futile effort to escape, only succeeding in getting himself stuck with his blood-soaked side pressed into the brick beside him. "Hey kid, I'm Eraserhead." "You," Shinso seemed to consider him. "What kind of name is that?" Strangely, 𝐲𝐸 could feel the tentative brush of his quirk against his mind. Interesting. He wondered if that was merely a result of having all for one now, or maybe an aspect of erasure. He would have to ask Izuku later. You can blame present Mike for it. My husband's and I all sort of suck at names. He just sucks the least. 𝐲𝐸 watched as Shinso frowned slightly as he continued to fail to catch onto his mind with his quirk, 𝐲𝐸 gently brushing off the hooks as they began to make purchase. Shinso narrowed his eyes. "How the fuck are you doing that?" 𝐲𝐸 shrugged. "Erasure lets me turn off other people's quirks when I use it. It is mental like yours, so I probably just have a passive natural defense to counter yours." He slumped slightly at the answer. "Damn it, you're going to arrest me now, aren't you?" 𝐲𝐸 gave him a strange look, but was happy to note that he seemed to have given up his mental attack. "No, why would I do that? It is not illegal to use your quirk for self-defense, and I clearly scared you when you seemed to be already hurt. Do you want to come out of there so I can look over your side? That is sort of a lot of blood." He stared at 𝐲𝐸 like he had just grown a second head. "But I just used my villainous quirk on you. Kid, there is no such thing. Besides, if there was, I totally would have you beat, what with mine letting me steal the quirks of others, like 10 supposedly can." 𝐲𝐸 snorted. "A guy keeps the quirk of one Yakuza and suddenly he is the new symbol of evil." The boy went rigid again. "Wait, you're 10. 𝐲𝐸 held his finger to his lips, giving the kid a slow blink. "Don't tell anyone. I would rather not have to fight All Might if I don't have to. What with us actually being on the same side and all." He shifted his weight to lean up against the wall. "I wonder if I should call 9 and ask if he has been spreading more rumors about how big and scary I am again." 𝐲𝐸 internally preened when the boy gave him a slow blink in kind without seeming to register. "Are there actually 10 of you? Is that why you go by 10? Yes and no. It would be more correct to say I was attempt number 10. 𝐁𝐦 and I are both clones of the old 𝗵𝗲𝗻 all for one. I am just the only one that got the quirk, even if I don't really use it. 𝐲𝗏 was happy to note that ☆ seemed to have relaxed slightly again and was slowly creeping forward out of his hiding spot as best he could. Why not? With a quirk like that, it would be super easy to just get whatever you want, because the side effect of keeping a quirk that doesn't belong to you sucks. 𝐲𝗏 tapped the side of his head. Taking a quirk takes a little bit of the original owner's personality with it and leaves the new owner basically haunted by a memory of the previous person. One of the quirks I have aggravated that part to the point that I am full-blown haunted by the ghosts of the previous holders at all times. It isn't something I can switch off. I figure that 8 ghosts is plenty, especially when one of them is the ghost of my overly affectionate uncle. So, what? You have 9 quirks? 11 actually. My uncle's was a 2-for-1 deal. Mind you, one of them is literally useless outside of probably being the bit that he is attached to. All for One gave him a second quirk while he was still alive to try and save his life. It only sort of worked. He did probably live longer than he would have without it, but he did ultimately die from his heart condition. As for the other one unaccounted for, it was a copy, not an original, so it was ghost-free. ☆ seemed to ponder this. So why are you telling me all this? Isn't all this like super secret shit? Shouldn't you be worried about me telling the heroes or something? 𝐲𝗏 hummed. Yeah, but I am not terribly worried about you doing that. You seem like a smart kid that is just stuck in a bad place. I know what it is like to be in your shoes and know how lying in a situation like this could ruin any trust we could build later down the road. ☆ gave him another baffled look. Why on earth do you care about me possibly trusting you? Well, it would make it significantly harder to keep you if you don't want to stay with me. The glare was back. Keep me? I am not an object you can just claim like a prize. 𝐲𝗏 hummed. I know, but you are still legally a minor who clearly needs a place to stay where you would get 3 square meals a day. I just thought you might want to stay with my husbands, and given that I know none of us would care about your quirk, even if you used it against them. Like I said, I've been in your shoes before, and trust me, taking up my parents on a deal like I am offering you was probably the best decision I ever could have made. That seemed to unbalance the boy again. Wait, you are offering to adopt me? Obviously. What else would I be offering? Fuck, I don't know. You are a villain pretending to be a hero. Maybe to be your evil henchman or something. Or, you know, ☆ grimaced at the implication. Kid, child rapists or something that even most villains can't stand. Most of us aren't cartoonishly evil crazy people, but people stuck with the label thanks to circumstance. Like you have been. He held out a hand in offering. As for the henchman thing, I have more of those than I know what to do with thanks to 9, so unless you really want to be one, I would advise you try a different career path. ☆ considered his hand for a moment before reaching out as if to take it. So if I was to decide I don't like it with you, you would let me leave and go back to doing my own thing? Sure, if that is what you decide. I would probably still keep an eye out for you, but I wouldn't force you to stay if you weren't happy. ☆ grabbed his hand, allowing 𝐲𝗏 to gently help him pull himself from his hiding place. Once out, 𝐲𝗏 winced as the boy contorted himself with a grimace to fish out his hastily hidden bag from under the dumpster. After a moment, the boy straightened up, emotional mask back on. Now what? 𝐲𝗏 gently tapped the boy's bloody side, earning him a wince of pain. Now you are going to let me see about getting that taken care of. Let me see your handiwork. I need to know if I am taking you to the hospital or just taking you home. If it isn't too bad, trust me, you would rather have the doctors take care of it over me using 𝗏𝗏 to patch you up, even if 𝗏𝗏 would be faster. Not having a scar where you are expecting to see one can sometimes screw with your head a bit if you don't have a self-healing quirk and are used to expecting to not ever scar. Speaking from experience, 𝐲𝗏 waved his right hand a bit. I suffered from a pretty bad hand injury when I was not much older than you that didn't heal properly. Let me tell you, it took ages to get used to not seeing crooked fingers every time I went to reach for something. ☆ sighed and pulled up his shirt to expose an absolute mess. A massive set of 3 parallel gashes ran from his left pectoral to curl to the base of his hip that he had clearly tried to stitch up himself with normal sewing thread. The injury was actually largely healed shut, but it seemed that he had torn open a couple of his stitches when he had tried squeezing into his hiding spot. Miraculously, it didn't seem infected. 𝐲𝗏 hissed at the sight. Yeah, let's get you to the hospital. How did you manage to keep that clean? I brainwashed a guy for his bottle of gin and rinsed it with it. Like I said, smart. What happened with the guy who did this? Guy got mad at me for using my quirk on him to make him leave me alone and came back and attacked me once he got free. I was able to trick him a second time to get away, but he clawed me before I did. 𝐲𝗏 held out a hand for ☆ to take again and began to lead him out of the back alley in the direction of the hospital. Think you could give me a good description of him? I'm sure the other heroes would be more than happy to help bring that guy in if he has that sort of violent reaction to you just reflexively using your quirk to get him to leave you alone. It wasn't reflexive. 𝐲𝗏 gave him a wink. The heroes don't have to know that though. That earned him a small smile as they lapsed into silence, walking hand in hand, ☆ slowly tightening the distance between them. It took a few minutes, but soon enough they were both blinking in the harsh light of the hospital emergency room. 𝐸𝐸𝐸𝐸, 𝐲𝐴, just a heads up, I am not coming home from my patrol alone tonight. I am invoking my one stray rule. Oh, a new friend for Sushi and Bastard. We want pictures 𝐲𝐴, 22XX0429546126. JPEG, could one of you set up the guest room if you get home before us? Our 𝐶𝐻 shouted that is a whole-ass teenager. The stray rule was for cats only, 𝐲𝐴. I know his name is Shinso Hitoshi, and he is only 2 weeks older than Izuku. He needs someplace actually safe to stay after going through the same kind of bullshit I went through as a kid. 𝐬𝐡𝐤. He looks worse than you did living on the streets at that age, 𝐲𝐴. That is only because I had the school and you feeding me twice a day. He stopped going to school when they kept forcing him to go back to his abusive fosters and obviously has been on his own for food since. You look like you're in the hospital. Is the kid okay besides the whole starving thing? 𝐲𝐴. The doctors are redoing the stitches he gave himself after a guy attacked him for brainwashing him into leaving him alone after his control wore off. He is going to have some pretty impressive scarring from it, but should be fine. I would have fixed him up myself. We are more here so I can talk to a nutritionist about getting him up to a healthy weight. 𝐬𝐡𝐤. I like how we are all just accepting that you are surprised adopting him like your dad did with you. I mean, this is still pretty on brand for 𝐲𝐴. Why do you think I wanted us to apply for emergency foster licenses? I know I am just as bad as my dad when it comes to people I am attached to. 𝐬𝐡𝐤. I just think it is cute how you got attached to the kid so quickly. As 𝐬𝐡𝐤 kept texting 𝐲𝐴, Oboro repocketed his phone with an exasperated sigh. While this was not how he was expecting the three of them to become parents, he was frankly not that surprised. As he had said, this was pretty on brand for 𝐲𝐴. After all, he himself had one day just basically been picked up by 𝐲𝐴 and the man had never let him go. Not that he had wanted to leave after the man had saved his life. Twice, something that both Oboro and 𝐬𝐡𝐤 had realized at some point was how easy it was for 𝐲𝐴 to hyperfixate onto things, onto people. It was something he had clearly inherited from his father, from the older villain's track record of behavior. When either of them decided that someone was important, they latched onto them and didn't let go easily. The kid had been screwed the moment 𝐲𝐴 had seen him. Oboro just hoped the kid knew what he was agreeing to when he had accepted 𝐲𝐴's offer to help. 𝐸𝐸𝐸𝐸 was a fucking weirdo. That was a fact that was painfully obvious to Hitoshi even before he had admitted defeat and let the guy help him unwedge himself from behind that dumpster. What sort of secret supervillain tells a random kid they found on the street exactly who they are and gives them everything that they would need to turn them into the heroes and out them and their significant others as secretly actually being villains? Okay, he didn't really have proof of the latter being true for both Present Mike and Loud Cloud, but with how open about being a secret supervillain the guy was being with Hitoshi, they had to know at least, right? And if they did, they at the very least were guilty of collaboration if nothing else. Hitoshi would have been worried that the guy had wanted him for his quirk if it wasn't for it. The guy had expressed basically no interest in it, and he literally could have just taken it and left like he had with that Yakuza guy. So Hitoshi had no idea what the guy wanted with him, but he wasn't stupid. There had to be a reason he was offering for Hitoshi to stay with him. A reason he was clearly trying to win him over. Still, he decided to play along at least until he healed up, since he was not going to pass up the food and painkillers being offered to him for free after having to deal with his injury by himself for the past week. He wasn't stupid. After they walked out of the very awkward doctor's visit that Ten had done most of the talking for, Ten had pulled out his phone to text someone like he had been doing on and off since they had arrived at the hospital. As curious as he was about that, he didn't ask, the long-ingrained habit of not asking questions flaring back up again. Thankfully, the identity of the person on the other side of the message that Ten had sent was revealed shortly as the familiar dark mist of Loud Cloud's signature warp gates appeared before them, which Ten was quick to guide Hitoshi through. So quick, he nearly stumbled on the other side and likely would have fallen had the hero on the other side not caught him. Ten gave him an apologetic look. Sorry for the rush, Shinso. We just didn't want to risk Bastard escaping again. Bastard? The question escaped him in his slightly shocked state. Ten seemed to be pretty good about doing that, he noted. Something warm and solid collided with his shin, prompting him to look down. Loud Cloud gestured down at the fairly large black cat that had apparently headbutted him. You can blame 𝐲𝐴 for the name. None of us could decide on one for him, but he kept referring to him as the bastard cat. Well, he eventually started to answer to the name. As you can see, he hates being ignored. Hitoshi was crouched down, showering the cat in affection before the hero could finish talking. Well, how dare you ignore him? He clearly deserves all the love and attention. Yes, you do. Hitoshi was rewarded with a happy slow blink from the handsome boy that he returned in kind before he was blessed with a lick on the arm and lots of purrs. Oh god, he is just you in purple, no wonder you instantly got attached. Shoo. That broke Hitoshi from his cat lover spell as he was reminded that he was not in fact alone with the cat. If he hadn't already known that Present Mike would be there on some level and hadn't recognized his voice from Put Your Hands Up radio, Hitoshi would admit he would not have recognized the blonde out of costume, with his long hair pulled back in a messy bun, normal glasses, and plain sweatpants and t-shirt. He was barely identifiable. Are we sure he isn't actually a clone too? Ten opened his mouth, likely to dispute the accusation, before snapping it shut and seeming to consider Hitoshi's face before beginning to slightly pale. Oh, shit. We actually should probably check that. Hitoshi froze. Wait, you don't really think that I could be a clone like you, right? Ten crouched down to his eye level. Kid, I am going to be level with you. The doctor who created me and most of my brothers has been completely off our radar since around the point in time you would have been conceived. It is wholly possible that when he got spooked and ran, he abandoned you like he did with me when he wrote me off as dead with my surrogate mother. We could of course be completely wrong, but Hisashi isn't exactly wrong about you looking like a palette swap of myself. Could you humor me for a couple seconds while I check? Hitoshi looked at Ten's hand that he had extended. So what? You have a paternity test quirk or something? Ten snorted. You remember the quirk I stole? Overhaul lets me break down and rearrange things on a molecular level. It is an extremely versatile quirk as a result. I plan on using it to break down both our chromosomes and compare and contrast. If you have more than a 50% match to me, you would be a clone. If not, we can just laugh it off as a fun coincidence. After a beat, Hitoshi took his hand. So how long will this take? Sparks began to flicker over both of their skin. Not too long. I process the information faster than real time, so just give me a minute to focus. Hitoshi noticed both Present Mike and Loud Cloud exchange worried looks while they waited, before Hitoshi could have considered doing anything more than just sit there petting their cat. Ten broke away with a curse before hopping up and beginning to pace the room in clear agitation. But that doesn't make any sense. Present Mike reached out to grab his shoulder and stop him. Shoo, what's wrong? None of us are mind readers. Is he one of your brothers then? Ten quickly shook his head. No, he isn't another clone of Dad. He is a clone of me. I am not just saying a clone made using the same blueprints as myself, but one made from an actual sample of me. He is a 93% match, including the gene mutations that I gained after gaining my copy of One for All. If he was cloned using the same blueprints I had alone, he wouldn't have that. Outside of the mutations he has that caused his shift in coloration and that lead to the changes in erasure to that of his own quirk, he is identical outside of the changes I gained after taking Overhaul. He literally is carrying copies of all of my quirks outside of those two that are just waiting to be switched on. Hitoshi froze. Wait, are you telling me that I actually have more than one quirk? Ten nodded. Theoretically, yes. Honestly, I am shocked you haven't accidentally used some of the others by now, especially with how easy it is to accidentally trigger Blackwhip. Hitoshi was glad that at least the two heroes seemed just about as stunned by this proclamation of fact as Hitoshi seemed to be. However, when Ten raised a hand and let a familiar tendril of energy curl out around his fingers. Wait, my threads are a completely different quirk. Ten seemed to stiffen. Threads. Hitoshi flicked his hand out toward the man, mentally casting a more solid line. The thread, like Ten's, was black in color as it curled around the man's wrist. They are sort of like puppet strings that I can use to manually control a person's limbs if I really try when my quirk can't hold onto a person. They aren't very good for anything except dragging someone closer or temporality tangling them up. Ten gently plucked at the string. That is because you aren't allowing enough emotion through for them to feed off of. Still, this not only is additional proof that you are actually my son, but proves that we probably will be able to play off some of your additional quirks as facets of your own unique one. We can probably write off both parts of One for All since you wouldn't have any power really stockpiled, and I doubt that you would any more willingly give away your small collection than I would mine. The same goes for All for One if you inherited the ability to use it, since that is not a quirk that you should openly broadcast as having. With Blackwhip already covered, that leaves Gear Shift, Fajin, Danger Sense, Smokescreen, and Float. I am uncertain how you could explain away the first two, so it would probably be best to hide those as well, given that Danger Sense warns you of incoming ill intent. That is easily explained by the nature of your mental quirk, and you probably actually have been doing that to yourself already if it is active as well. Smokescreen is easy enough to play off so long as you keep a couple smoke bombs on you, which is what I have been doing. Float, though, I suppose it could be passed off as another application of your thread, since on its own it merely allows one to hang suspended in midair and not actually fly. Hitoshi probably would have only caught maybe half of the last half of Ten's tangent had the man not been bleeding his train of thought across the bond the thread provided. Hitoshi couldn't read minds technically, but emotions were easy, and with the man's tight focus on theorizing how to best hide his status as someone with multiple quirks, he was able to catch nearly all of what amounted to a mumble storm. You are getting ahead of yourself. I'm not even sure I can do any of that stuff. Ten jolted as his mental train derailed before giving Hitoshi a wide grin. Well, there is only one way to find out. 𝐸𝐸𝐸𝐸 𝐻𝐸𝐬 is my clone, not as in he was cloned identically to how I was, but that he was cloned from me from a sample taken after I woke up. He has copies of the quirks inside of OFA and possibly AFO. We still need to find a way to test that one, since I would rather not use Hisashi or Oboro as test subjects. What? That makes no sense. Where the hell did he come from in the last timeline if that was true? 𝐬𝐸, given that brainwashing seems to be a mutation of erasure, I can only assume that the doctor got his hands on a sample of your blood and cloned you at some point, or recycled the same blueprints for him. The why he did it then or now and why 𝗫𝐸 was abandoned are probably mysteries we are not going to solve until we actually find the man. Still, the point remains that this version of him at least is my kid and not yours. Congrats on becoming an uncle to a kid who is physically 2 weeks older than you. Please warn me before you plan on informing AFO. Oh, I would rather not be around to deal with him when he finds out he is actually a grandfather with how he has been about me. At least I understand at least why you folded so quickly to him as your father now, 𝐬𝐸. It is best to just think of Dad as an overly affectionate cat-like bastard. BTW, why didn't you just mention how much of a cat person 𝗫𝐸 is? I would have offered him cat pictures while I was calming him down after I found him had I known, and let you, Hisashi, and Oboro miss his reaction to bastard. How is he, by the way? 𝐬𝐸. He had a pretty nasty set of cuts from a guy who clawed him with his quirk that he stitched up himself. The scar he is going to have from that isn't going to be pretty, but outside of being severely underweight he is in pretty good shape. I wish his morals had been slightly worse though, since he really should have started stealing food using brainwashing before I could have found him. Oh, before I forget, is 𝗫𝐸 being unable to brainwash me an erasure thing or not? Yeah, it is erasure. It was probably one of the only reasons he started talking with us after we adopted him. Is he talking more or is he still mostly mute? 𝐬𝐸. He's pretty chatty actually. I think I confused him enough that he is too shocked about everything going on to try and stop himself from asking questions. Even with Hisashi and Oboro, when do you want to meet him? This weekend, maybe on my rest day. Out of curiosity, was All Might this crazy with your training for OFA? How the hell does he expect me to clean an entire trash beach by myself in just 10 months? 𝐬𝐸. He's not. It is possible though, given that I did it. Problem child, you are completely insane, 𝐬𝐸. Plus Ultra, you want help figuring out how to do it, or are you going to go full Izuku on it? If you figured it out, so can I. See you on set at your place. I guess Hitoshi was convinced that the whole family was nuts. At first his cousin had seemed like a relatively normal level-headed dude in the train wreck that was the Midoriya family, but then he started rapidly getting buffer and buffer every time they saw each other. So curious as to how that was happening, he had asked. That brought him to today, sitting on the retaining wall of a trash beach as Izuku picked up a full fucking refrigerator over his head and carried it up the stairs as if the thing didn't weigh more than double his own weight. Izuku, how the fuck are you doing that? Izuku snorted and dropped the fridge in the back of the pickup truck that hauled off the trash at the end of the day every day. Strength quirks are bullshit. My quirk is finally coming in, which is why I have been able to build muscle so quickly. If you think this is impressive, you should see the sort of shit Dad pulls all the time around the apartment when he helps Mom clean. So you have just been cleaning up all the junk on this beach for the past few months. I've been running more frequently too and doing a few other things, but yeah, that is the gist of it. Hitoshi shook his head. Everyone in this family is fucking insane. Mood, young Midoriya, good morning. Hitoshi jumped slightly at the call, but from the complete lack of reaction from Izuku, he had probably been expecting it. He turned in the direction of the call. Morning, Yagi. Hitoshi was immediately reminded of himself as he spotted the very sickly-looking scarecrow of a man. While Hitoshi had put on some weight in the past few months since his dad had found him, he was hardly the image of health himself. It didn't take long for the man to spot Hitoshi as well. Oh, you brought a friend along to keep you company? Izuku shook his head and gestured to Hitoshi. Family, Toshi, my physical trainer Yagi Toshinori. Yagi, 𝗫𝐸 Hitoshi. Toshi is Xiaoda's recently adopted kid, in case you were wondering. Oh, so that was why Izuku had wanted Hitoshi to hang out with him for his training instead of just explaining. Yaga's face when Izuku called him Toshi was pretty funny. It was probably weird hearing a nickname he was used to being directed at himself used for someone else. Sup, Yagi did give him an interested once-over. I did hear that Eraserhead, Loud Cloud, and Present Mike had adopted a kid. I just didn't realize you would be so close in age to young Midoriya here. Hitoshi snorted. Yeah, I wasn't exactly expecting to end up with an uncle younger than me when Dad fished me out from behind a dumpster. But here we are. So how did a guy in your kind of shape end up as a personal trainer? Yagi winced. Well, my current condition is a fairly recent development. It is hard to keep on weight when you don't exactly have a stomach anymore. He still is pretty knowledgeable in the field even if he can't apply it to himself anymore, Izuku threw out as he carried a pair of tires up the steps, one under each arm. Hitoshi frowned. What, are you just not eating at all? I am pretty sure there are diets out there for people with that sort of issue. Yagi looked sheepish and glanced away. I might miss meals here and there. I have been getting better since I gave young Midoriya my phone number since he started sending me a reminder to eat text whenever he is eating himself. Oh, mood. Dad made me set meal time and snack alarms on my phone to make sure I eat since I genuinely can't feel when I am hungry anymore from the eating disorder I developed while living on the streets for so long. That earned him a sympathetic look from Yagi. Could I ask what exactly happened? Itoshi shrugged. Sure, it is basically the same story as Dad. I was already in the system when my quirk came in and people decided it was completely villainous and reacted accordingly. After the better part of a decade dealing with that shit, I just completely left my abusive fosters and the school that was sending me back to them. The lack of food and usually being out in the weather sucked, but outside of one incident that led to Dad finding me, I was pretty safe from being hurt since I could use my quirk to stop any attack and get away. And what is your quirk? Itoshi summoned the threads of black whip around his fingers so he could avert his eyes to play cat's cradle with him, in a coping mechanism that his dad had offered to him as an alternative to just shutting down like he was used to. My quirk is formally registered under the name Brainwashing, but Dad is trying to help me get it changed to Puppeteer. I can control a person's actions to a limited degree if I can snag them either with my voice or with one of my physical threads, but it is easy for people to break out of it if they are even just jostled slightly. Dad thinks my quirk might work by making people fall into a sleepwalker-like state before hijacking the muscles of the target to follow simple orders, but we still need to do more testing on that. Yagi sighed. Unfortunately, I can see why that would be considered villainous by most. The perceived attack on one's free will would not likely go over well with most. What about you? Huh? Itoshi gestured to Yagi. What's your quirk? Oh, I am actually quirkless myself. Really? Itoshi looked over to Izuku for confirmation, who nodded before going back to picking apart the trash pile he had been working on cleaning up. Huh, that is pretty rare these days. Yagi just shrugged and sat down on the wall next to him. It was not too uncommon when I was still your age that it is strange for me to think about the fact that false flags like young Midoriya are what make up the bulk of those of us left. It is becoming more common to use the term quirkless for those who merely have invisible quirks than for the truly quirkless alone. That got a snort from Izuku as he dropped off a few more bags of trash. Yeah, if it wasn't for the muscle I built up letting me bench press a refrigerator no problem, I would still be considered quirkless too. That is the problem with stockpiler quirks. Until you actually start stockpiling something easily identifiable and at high enough levels, they are easy to brush off as not there. A lot of mental quirks with no outside indicator suffer from the same issue, and most people with them nowadays use the genetic family history of certain types of mental quirks as proof to not get completely written off. I think 𝐲𝐸's detective friend Tsukachi's family has had issues with that because their lie detection quirks give no outward indication of use. The fairly nice detective's name earned an odd strained look from Yagi. Is something wrong? Yagi sighed. Just a reminder of a mistake I made a few years back. Detective Tsukachi and I used to be friends beforehand, but now. He shook his head. It has just been a while since we have spoken, and I can't help but think he would likely not accept my apology for snapping at him over our difference in opinion. Itoshi hummed in consideration. Well, I mean, it would not be like he could think you were lying if you just told him you were sorry. So long as you are telling the truth, he would know you were. That seemed to brighten him up. You're right. Thank you, young ♯. Now I just feel a bit silly for not realizing that. Izuku rolled his eyes at the man. You let yourself get stuck in your own head again. You seem to do that a lot, Yagi. Yagi blushed slightly at the accusation. Well, I do have to agree. I do have to admit to feeling slightly attacked right now. Izuku huffed and lightly shoved the stick of a man. Go call him or something already. I'll text you when the truck is full up and you can come back later. Toshi and I can hang out while you're gone. Right. I will see you later, young Midoriya. Then as quickly as he had appeared he was gone again. Itoshi turned back to Izuku, who was just shaking his head. He seems nice. He's All Might, of course he is. And suddenly Hitoshi felt the rug pulled out from under him. But wait, what? Izuku stopped halfway back down the steps. Wait, did they not tell you All Might's real name yet? That is sort of important, especially for you all things considered. No, wait, how was that him? You just told me he was quirkless. He is. The quirk he has been using is one for all. Once he fully transfers it to me in a few more months, he is going to go back to being fully quirkless again once the traces left of it burn out. Sorry, if I had known that you wouldn't know who you were dealing with, I would have warned you. Still, you did a good job at setting up your multifaceted quirk in his head so he is less likely to suspect you have more than one and put two and two together. Yagi is pretty sharp but has a bad habit of railroading himself down a line of thinking. It is how he is so completely blind about 𝐲𝐸. Seriously. All he would have to do is really look at him and he would see that he and Ten are the same person. Itoshi frowned, looking off in the direction that the man had run off. So what? You are conning him out of his quirk so that he isn't a threat anymore or something? More like he told me point blank I was his future successor for one for all, and I just didn't argue since I would rather that I have it than some other random kid. 𝐲𝗏 told you the quirk is strong enough to break bones now if used incorrectly, right? Hitoshi flinched before looking down at his own hands in worry. And I have that. Izuku huffed before walking over to ruffle his hair. No, you should be fine. You might have copies of everything that is stockpiled in it, but you clearly don't have the same power build up, or I'm sure that you would be able to at least pick me up since it passively increases strength too, just not to such a degree. Hitoshi huffed and swatted the boy's hand away. It's not my fault that you weighed a stupid amount with all those muscles. Izuku gave a small huffing chuckle. Once you get back up to a healthy weight, I am sure your dads would be more than happy to help you work out so you can one day be that strong. 𝐸𝐸𝐸𝐸. Deku was fucking weirding Katsuki out. Okay, he had been doing that for a few months now. Ever since Katsuki had told him to take a swan dive off the roof, he had grown quiet, unnervingly so. His annoying but previously near constant muttering had petered out to be replaced with a strange empty silence. Katsuki might have actually worried that Deku was actually considering taking his advice had it not been for the fact that he had seemingly buckled down and finally gotten serious with his physical training to try and be a hero. Deku's shoulders had slowly begun to broaden with muscles, and you would have had to have been blind to miss them when they changed for gym. The fact that Deku had never seemed to take hero shit like that seriously had always pissed him off. It was as if he thought that he was better than everyone else and didn't need to actually try despite his clear disadvantage of being a quirkless freak. Still, he was not surprised to see him at the UA entrance exam. He was however surprised to see him turn up, glued to the side of some purple-haired fucker. One that ended up seated next to them in their assigned seats in the massive lecture hall for the pre-testing orientation. Katsuki narrowed his eyes at Ibex. Deku, why is this extra following you around? Deku went rigid and turned to offer Katsuki a cold look he had never seen on his face before. This is my brother's adopted son Shinso Hitoshi, not an extra. Toshi, this is Bakugo. That was so wrong on so many levels. Since when did Deku call him Bakugo? How long had that been a thing? Katsuki suddenly had the sinking realization that Deku hadn't used his name at all in nearly the whole year that had passed since it had been announced to the class that Deku was also trying for UA. Ibex blinked and seemed to study Katsuki. Ah, the ex-friend. I would say it was a pleasure, but it really isn't. He turned back to Deku. Do we really have to sit next to him for the next half hour or more? Deku snorted. Unfortunately, maybe if we are lucky Mike will get through the overview faster this year. Thankfully, neither of us will be in the same testing center as him, so we shouldn't have to put up with him after this. What the fuck is that supposed to mean? Deku blandly turned back to Katsuki. Just that if you pass the entrance exam, we won't be in the same class as one another. Now, was there something that you actually needed, or can I go back to talking with my actual friend? Slightly dumbstruck, Katsuki averted his gaze to look around the room to try and figure out who his real competition would be. After all, there was no way that Deku was going to pass still, and if Ibex was anything like him, he was even more screwed because the guy looked like a stiff breeze might have blown him over. They didn't matter. Not anymore. 𝐸𝐸𝐸𝐸. 𝐲𝗏 got several worried looks from his colleagues as he stepped into the control booth for the entrance exam for the first time ever in the many years he had held the position of one a homeroom teacher. This was going to suck, but there was no way he wasn't going to watch how much better his brother and his son would do this time around and get a chance to see his former classmates and now future students again. All Might seemed to take in all the worried looks at him and his likely slightly green face with some concern. Midoriya, are you alright? Nope. 𝐲𝗏 tried focusing on the fact that Obaro's hand was in his own. Everything would be just fine. Thankfully, Nezu clarified his situation for him. Midoriya was involved in a major testing accident back when he took this test himself and has reasonably declined ever joining us and watching in the past due to the unnecessary stress it causes for him. Unfortunately, with both his younger brother and his son taking the test this year, not watching would likely have been even more stressful for him, despite the fact I have done everything in my power to prevent repeats of his near brush with death at the hands of the prior administration to myself. Obaro reached over with his free hand to rub circles on 𝐲𝗏's back as he slumped down into one of the chairs that Nezu had clearly kept available for him. It is one of the main reasons his class skips the new school year orientation in favor of doing a quirk assessment test. Since he can't really stomach even rewatching the test footage, it lets him get a feel for his class better than just relying on reading the scores after the fact and hearing all our thoughts on the kids. 𝐲𝗏 snorted. The current test is a biased nightmare and should be replaced. Nezu huffed. Yes, well, when you can convince the board of your alternative, I would be more than happy to implement it. They like the bias towards flashier quirks since it later makes the sports festival more interesting. And, yes, I know you would rather we change how the sports festival is broadcast, but again, that is out of my hands. 𝐲𝗏 huffed and forced himself to look at the screens. Which ones are for sites B and C? As he was pointed to the appropriate screens, he was quick to spot a harassing a bored but relaxed-looking Izuku, much as he had back during 𝐲𝗏's own test in the original timeline. He pointed it out to 𝗵𝗲. It looks like Tensei's younger brother found mine. 𝗵𝗲 perked up slightly. Oh, that's exciting. You think they might be future friends in the making? Depends on what they are saying. Izuku at least doesn't seem opposed to the idea, so there is that. Oh, there is Hitoshi. 𝐲𝗏 followed his husband's gesture to another screen. Oh, well, that was interesting, wasn't it? I think Hitoshi has a crush. That got Nimari's attention from where she had been eavesdropping. Oh, are we looking at a future couple in the making? 𝐲𝗏 watched as his son openly laughed at something that Kirishima had said before mimicking the manly pose the boy had just done, earning him a laugh in return. Maybe. Still, that is the most unguarded I have seen him around strangers since I found him. 𝗵𝗲 chuckled. It seems our son has possibly found his designated extrovert at least. Designated extrovert. Oh, right. All Might was still listening. Nimari giggled at the question. It is a trend that we noticed a while back because of 𝐲𝗏. Introverts generally find at least one extrovert by the end of the first day of classes and stick with them through graduation and sometimes longer, like these dorks. Your intern Lemillion is one for 𝐴𝐻𝐾𝐿's intern SunEater, if you hadn't already noticed, and I am pretty sure you are Sir Night Eyes. All Might blushed and scratched the back of his head. Oh, well, now I feel slightly silly for not noticing that. 𝐲𝗏 snorted and shook his head. It is more of an introvert thing than an extrovert thing. All Might nodded before he seemed to be struck by a thought. You've never seemed to have any issues with chatting with me when we have crossed paths over the years. 𝐲𝗏 shrugged. Introvert does not equate antisocial. I sort of have to be with my husbands. I just find socializing draining instead of energizing after a while, so I get burnt out on people faster. Snipe chuckled from the other side of the room. Trust me, if he isn't in the mood to talk with you, you will never find him. 𝐲𝗏 flipped the other hero off, earning a laugh. Oh, well, at least that had calmed him down at least. Maybe things would not be so bad this time round. 𝐸𝐸𝐸𝐸. Nezu felt his fur bustle in genuine fear for the first time in well over a decade as Midoriya 𝐲𝗏 glared at him from the other side of the bed. His younger brother now slept in, following the mending of his broken bones. It was in that moment he received a powerful reminder that his employee was one of the few individuals in existence that posed him an actual legitimate threat. After all, it would take no time at all for the man to clear the bed and rip his consciousness, his very being, from himself by removing his quirk. There was a reason he was trying to be as helpful as possible to the man. So long as he viewed him as an ally, then he was safe. Additionally, there had been the benefit of keeping the villain where he could keep a close eye on him on the off chance that he had been faking his interest in being a hero and was only using the position to help hide in plain sight from All Might. Needless to say, he had been more than a little relieved to discover that, generally speaking, the man was actually a good hero and teacher. Yes, his methods at times had been somewhat strange at first, but Nezu could hardly deny the results he got any more than he had with Gran Torino. The two of them combined had increased the survival rate of former hero students entering the field in their first year from the abysmally low 36% to nearly 85% for UA, which was practically unheard of. Still, that did nothing to remove the fact that as 10, Midoriya had been nearly just as active on the villain side of things. Sure, there were no new reports of people turning up missing quirks, but Nezu had noticed a clear pattern of lesser-known heroes dropping dead in accidents more and more frequently, as well as the rumors he had heard of the villain 9 who was acting under the name of his younger brother, who was starting to display some of those very heroes' quirks. It seemed that while 10 seemed largely against stealing quirks for himself at the moment, he was not above reallocating them as he saw fit. It hardly mattered if it was he himself doing it or All for One when it was being done in his name and he was doing nothing to stop it. Nezu was just relieved that every young hero that seemed to have had the man as homeroom teacher seemed to be safe from being targeted. Sure, all other previous UA graduates seemed to be fair game if what happened with young Takayama was indeed them as he suspected. Still, it was better than he had hoped for when he first employed the villain. Why did this all matter? Because he had nearly allowed history to repeat itself with the entrance exam. Nezu gave Midoriya his best apologetic look. I have spoken with Majima about how this could have happened. It seems that the zero-pointer in Site B had been suffering from a faulty AI and managed to slip through inspection. Despite receiving the necessary signals from both its sensors and my attempt at a manual shutdown from the command center to stop it before it could run over lagging students, its AI ignored the signals and was intent on pretending that it had not received them. While it is extremely unfortunate that your brother had to push his quirk over his limit to get the pin girl out of there, I can say without a shadow of a doubt he likely saved her life. Midoriya's frown deepened. How did something like this even happen? Don't you personally inspect the robots with Majima to ensure shit like this doesn't happen? Nezu sighed. Only when we first receive the robots. Any robots reused from year to year are only given a passing inspection to check for any parts that might need replacing before the test and clear data corruption to the AI that might have happened while they were kept in storage. The fault was an issue with the personality of the robot, so was missed in the general inspection. To put it bluntly, the robot had gone insane over the past couple years and finally just snapped. As a result, we are going to start doing the personality screening that we do on the new AIs when they come in before any robots are used again. Midoriya finally broke off his intense glare in favor of looking over his sleeping younger brother. You should have been doing that from the start. Kids could have died from that mistake. I know, as am I aware that there is little I can do to truly apologize enough for it. Midoriya huffed and leaned back in his seat. You know, 𝐬𝐴 swears up and down at this point that I am completely cursed by Murphy's Law. That asking what could go wrong around me is basically issuing a direct challenge at the universe to completely fuck with me. That startled a laugh from Nezu. Oh dear, I'm sorry Midoriya, I was just not expecting that. Midoriya cracked a smile at his reaction. It's fine, Nezu. I am sure 𝐬𝐴 will be happy to hear his joke at my expense earned a laugh from someone. Nezu shook his head. Still, that was hardly professional of me. Midoriya snorted. And who is going to rat you out about lowering your guard once in a while in private? Surely not me, the king of unprofessionalism? Nezu flicked his tail at the thought. I would hardly say that. Despite how you present yourself outwardly for the public, you are one of the better teachers and pro-heroes I have on staff, even considering your less than legal proclivities. He seemed to hum in thought, turning back to his brother before they lapsed into silence. Finally Midoriya looked back at him. Nezu, would you consider us friends? Oh, that was better than he had been hoping for by fostering this strange relationship. Still, Nezu found himself weighing the cost of honesty. No, but that is no slight to you, but an admission of my very nature. I don't process emotions and relationships the same way that humans like yourself do. Still, I do consider us currently allies, or at the very least as non-aggressive towards one another. Nezu saw a tinge of sadness in Midoriya's gaze. I used to think I couldn't have real friends too, you know. It was to help keep me safe after being hurt so many times before by one that I had trusted. I am glad that 𝐬𝐴 and 𝗵𝗲 forced me to lower my guard and try again. I know that other humans hurt you in the past, so I can hardly blame you for building up a wall like I myself have. I just hope perhaps when you finally feel safe you can too. That was like a kick in the teeth for Nezu. He could count on one paw the number of times he had been seen like that by a human. Perhaps he should reassess his thoughts on Midoriya's clear offer when he was alone in the safety of his nest. I'll think about it. Thank you for forgiving me for my failing to keep my promise. Midoriya just sighed. I only did because I know you, Nezu. A kid dying on your watch is something I know you would never stand for. Yes, Nezu supposed. Midoriya did. Izuku felt slightly mortified as 𝐲𝗏 walked him home following the entrance exam. After all the shit he had given him about breaking so many bones as a student during the entrance exam, and he ended up doing the exact same thing. They were nearly back to the apartment when suddenly, a shit-eating grin crawled across his brother's face. You know, I think that now this makes you the problem child. Izuku groaned and buried his reddening face in his hands. He really hated how easily emotions came to his face now, as much as he was enjoying his second shot of a childhood. Shut up. 𝐲𝗏 reached over and ruffled his hair. Look on the bright side. Now that you've done it once, you should know how to stop it from happening again so easily next time. Plus, you will be getting a set of full gauntlets for my island soon enough to help with the backlash. Izuku shoved his hands back into his pockets. Did everyone pass that did the last time? 𝐲𝗏 hummed. Everyone except Aoyama, but he didn't take the hero practical this time around. Probably because without Dad forcing him into it as the UA spy, he might be trying something else out. On the bright side, Hitoshi will be the one to take his seat. Izuku nodded in acceptance. And Bakugo, despite the concerns I raised about his behavior, he still got in. I traded him for Monoma in the end to keep you two apart at least. It took a bit of persuading on Kan's part, but that is only because Monoma hasn't shown his true competitive colors yet. He at least could not deny that if you and Kaken had to be in different classes, it would be better if you were with me, since I could shut off your quirk before you broke all your limbs again. While there is a lot that Kaken needs to work on improving, quirk control is not one of them. Izuku snorted. God, I wonder what his reaction would be to you calling him that in front of the other students. 𝐲𝗏 just gave a look of amusement. I changed his diapers as a baby multiple times. I've earned the right to keep calling him that in this timeline. Does he even know that you picked up the habit of calling him that from me when you were little? Izuku shrugged. While I know he remembers you exist obviously from how he reacted to me introducing him to Hitoshi, I don't think he realizes that you are both a pro hero and a teacher at UA. I can only assume he doesn't remember much about you outside of what I have mentioned to him in passing about you since you moved out to live with 𝐬𝐴 and 𝗵𝗲. I can't wait to see how he reacts to the revelation that I am related to 3 members of the UA staff. 4, technically, if you count the connection to All Might. Just a warning. Todoroki is a bit of a conspiracy theorist, so don't be surprised if he suddenly accuses you of being one of our secret love children. Izuku gave his brother a knowing look. Speaking from experience, let's just say our conversion before our fight at the sports festival was interesting and leave it at that. Katsuki chucked the stupid hologram projector at the wall. How the fuck was that fair? He got first place and they still stuck him in Class 1B. He was the future number 1. Why on earth would they stick him in the inferior class? He growled. This was all fucking Deku's fault, wasn't it? Hadn't he said something about them not ending up in the same class as each other if they both got it? Did fucking Deku's rich-ass father bribe someone at UA or something? He remembered hearing something from the hag about how the guy sued UA at one point back when he mentioned that he was applying there. Maybe that was it. He would just have to get his answers the first chance he could get Deku alone. Izuku winced as Bakugo slammed him into the brick wall behind the building after school ended. They had been told to hang back after classes to meet with the principal, who had wanted to call them up to congratulate them for making it into UA. Izuku would honestly admit to having been dreading this confrontation that he had realized was inevitable since 𝐲𝐸 had confirmed that Bakugo had still gotten into UA. After all, the top 10 scorers would have been on display for all of the students in the hero course to see on the acceptance letter holidays. What the fuck did you do, Deku? Why am I in the loser 1B class instead of 1A where I should be as the top scorer? Izuku arched his likely bruised back off of the wall. Bakugo, the students are sorted to match the teachers. Not all the top scorers end up in 1A. Look at Best Jeanist. He was in 1B. I am the future number 1 hero, not the fucking future 4th. Not with that attitude, you're not. Izuku felt himself sag slightly in relief as 𝐲𝐸 strolled into view. He must have planned for this. Bakugo glared at him. Fuck off, hobo. This is none of your business. 𝐲𝐸 ignored him in favor of meeting Izuku's gaze. You okay? Izuku shrugged. Might have bruised my back a bit, but I've had worse. Bakugo raised one hand in a threat, popping off his quirk. Don't you fucking ignore me. 𝐲𝐸 glared at him with erasure now activated as his hair swirled up and away from his face. Kakin, enough. That startled him enough to release Izuku as he sputtered in shock, trying and failing to trigger his quirk. What the fuck did you just call me? 𝐲𝐸 tilted his head slightly. Kakin, I can only assume you don't remember me at this point or you wouldn't be surprised. I don't think I ever called you anything else since Mitsuki thought it was funny. I'll reintroduce myself. I'm Midoriya 𝐲𝐸, also known as the pro hero Eraserhead, so you can knock it off with your quirk since it won't work if I don't want it to. Bakugo gritted his teeth but clenched his fists, signaling that he had stopped trying to use his quirk. What the fuck do you want? 𝐲𝐸 shrugged casually. I was just swinging by, hoping to catch Izuku to invite him over for dinner. And to possibly sleep over so my son wasn't home alone tonight since I accidentally got scheduled a Friday night patrol. Oh, and for reference, Izuku didn't even know you had gotten to UA until after the class roll list had already been decided between me and 𝐷_KING. I decided that you would be a better fit for his class since, unlike my future students, excepted maybe 3 if I am generous, you don't need any help with your quirk in some way to use it to its full potential. I can't be bothered to deal with deflating the ego this school has given you with that in mind. Just be glad I let him take you, or else you would likely be getting expelled from the course on the first day if you showed that sort of attitude with me. Bakugo growled. I don't fucking believe you. There is no way you are a fucking teacher at UA. 𝐲𝐸 just rolled his eyes and fished out his wallet before pulling out an easily identifiable UA ID card with the massive word of staff printed on it below his image. I'm an underground hero kid. It is sort of my job to not look like a pro hero so I can do my job better. Is there anything else, or can I take Izuku home now? Bakugo actually looked a bit ill now as the realization that he had actually been arguing with a teacher of his dream school that he had just been accepted into seemed to hit him. You're not going to put this on my record, are you? And get me kicked out before I can even attend, right? 𝐲𝐸 shook his head. Not so long as you agree to meet with Hound Dog at the end of orientation day to see about some anger management. You have your mother's temper obviously, so I can't exactly fault you for that. But you do need to learn how to better cope with that anger before someone actually gets hurt. One of these days someone might take all of your blustering seriously. What would you do if when you told someone to go die in your anger they actually did? Izuku felt a good deal comforted in how rapidly that had made the other boy pale and cast a panicked look at Izuku. Good. He finally seemed to realize how he had fucked up. He never would have. Izuku sighed. Bakugo, I have clinical depression. If my day had gone differently after we parted that day, there is no guarantee I wouldn't have. You would have just handed me the perfect excuse to just give up. Luckily for you, nearly dying in a villain attack was the shock to my system that I needed to realize I wanted to live, but it just as easily could have not been. 𝐲𝐸 came over to bonk Bakugo lightly on the head. The only reason I didn't blacklist you for that is the lack of evidence of the event, and because I knew you didn't actually mean it. Do better, because next time I will not be so lenient with you, kid or no. 𝐲𝐸 then offered his hand to Izuku to take. Let's go. The weeks leading up to the start of the new school year flew by as 𝐲𝐸 began to feel a nervous sort of excitement for the future to come. A future where his class would never have to face real villains before their due time. So many things had been changed it would be hard to find something untouched by his efforts. Sure, he had been unable to prevent all of the League of Villain members from falling to villainy. but the handful that had were either dead or now working under his own supervision by way of 𝐼 and occasionally their father. There would be no break-ins and attacks during the first week. The only excitement he had to look forward to was that of the normal start of the year and the reporters that were bound to turn up once word got around that 𝐷 was helping teach heroics classes. With that in mind, he silently dropped into the classroom on the first day from event and started a phone timer for the students to notice him. 𝐬𝐸 of course met his eyes immediately before excusing himself from 𝐸𝐸 and 𝑢𝑟aka to take his seat. Hitoshi also immediately noticed him and stiffened for a second in his place, sleeping at his desk before sitting up at attention with a yawn. As did Todoroki, who 𝐲𝐸 still was kicking himself about not being able to do anything for short of kidnapping him or picking a fight with 𝗫𝗫 and risk martyring the man. 𝐲𝐸 was at least amused that he seemed to follow the lead of the other two boys, as he seemed to study the pair of them like a puzzle at their own reactions. It took an additional 7 minutes for the rest to notice and fly to their seats. 𝐲𝐸 stopped the timer and turned it to face the students. Your situational awareness is abysmal. If I had been a villain planning on killing you all, you would have all died several times over in the time it took you to notice me. As you've all probably realized, I am the homeroom teacher for 1A, Midoriya 𝐲𝐸, and yes, before you all ask, Midoriya Izuku here is my younger brother. Now that all of that is out of the way, go get changed into your gym uniforms that UA provided for you and meet me down at the athletic fields in 10 minutes. Don't dawdle or consider yourself expelled. We are already running behind schedule. Izuku was surprised that his classmates waited until they were in the locker rooms changing before one of them asked, "So our homeroom teacher is really your brother? You don't look much alike." Izuku snorted. "Well yeah, I look almost identical to Mom and he looks just like Dad. Plus we are technically only biologically half-brothers since he is sort of from Dad's first marriage. Thus the age gap. It is not that large of an age gap." 𝐸𝐸 cut in. "My own older brother is the same age as him after all." Izuku hummed as he finished pulling on the uniform shirt. "Yeah, that is true I guess. Do you guys know where the field is or should I hang back to show you?" Izuku was not surprised to find that to be a no from everyone except Hitoshi. As 𝐲𝐸 totaled up the scores, he was not at all surprised to find 𝐼 at the bottom. Izuku had an advantage over his past self of not only having a teacher for how the quirk worked that actually knew how it worked, but was able to have his scores weighted appropriately for how long he had even had the quirk, especially given he had not actually broken anything again like 𝐲𝐸 had been forced to during his own assessment. Still, by the way, no one is getting expelled. That is not because all of this was a logical ruse or something, but because unlike my previous classes, even the lowest scoring among you show potential. Don't take this mercy for granted. If those of you currently lagging behind don't start to shape up, you're out of here. That is everything for class for today. You can pick up your schedules back in the classroom before you head home for the day. Dismissed. 𝐲𝐸 was not terribly surprised at the clear relief that fell over the formerly largely tense group. Leaving the students to themselves, he wandered over to round the corner that All Might was less than stealthily hiding behind. "You know, if you wanted to watch, you could have just come over. Also, stop wasting your time when no one is going to see you." All Might blushed before deflating. "I didn't want to distract any of them." All Might, you are a member of staff regardless what form you are in. While All Might watching would probably have been a bit distracting, Yagi Toshinori probably would have been fine. Literally the only two students who would recognize you like this wouldn't have cared and would hardly have revealed you to the rest of the class. He scratched the back of his head. "Oh, so your son knows about me now too. Hitoshi is going to be getting here and hanging back late with my husbands and I on days he doesn't go home with Izuku or any friends he might make, so was going to see you around the school eventually and ask, especially given how you introduced yourself to him. You're lucky that Hitoshi is pretty good at rolling with the punches, or the revelation that you're planning on retiring soon in wake of your declining health might have spooked him pretty badly." All Might winced and nodded. "My apologies. It is just that I am not used to the idea of so many people knowing." 𝐲𝐸 considered the man before a thought struck him. "You know, you and Hitoshi are scar buddies." That completely threw him. "Good. Pardon." 𝐲𝐸 tapped the man's left side. "Hitoshi has pretty massive scarring on his side there too from a villain attack while he was living on the streets. While it wasn't as deep, it covers a larger area, so don't be surprised if he is still a bit stiff in his movements around there. Part of the reason it is so bad is because he stitched it up himself originally." All Might looked horrified. "That is terrible. Why would he have had to do that?" 𝐲𝐸 frowned, once again reminded of how sheltered that All Might was despite having been a foster kid himself. Because if he had gone to a doctor by himself, he would have been dumped back into the situation that drove him into living on the streets again. Only in all likelihood they would have taken preventive measures to keep him from running again. That is what basically happened to me as a kid. It took years before I was able to run for the second time, and the only reason I didn't get caught was the school I had been attending didn't care that I was not going home at night provided I showed up in a clean uniform every day. 𝐲𝐸 was not sure how he felt about the look of pity he was getting from the man. I was not aware of that. I knew you spent some time in the system as well, but I had no idea it could be that bad. 𝐲𝐻 sighed. Yeah, I got lucky in the end by accidentally finding my missing biological father and growing up with a friend like 𝐬𝐻𝐸, but most kids with villainous quirks don't get that lucky. Most are like Hitoshi, all alone and vilified for something beyond their control. I want to do something to help change that, but there is only so much one guy can do. At the present, the best I can do is to teach the next generation of heroes so they can see the signs of abuse themselves and save more kids in turn. What we really need are more heroes with villainous quirks in the limelight. As much as I would have loved to lead by example there, I loathe the media too much to stand it, and I doubt that Hitoshi will be much different. I really hope that other kids with villainous quirks are planning on going limelight to try and help fill that gap. 𝐸𝐸𝐸𝐸. The next couple days flowed by with little incident outside of Izuku accidentally breaking an ankle kicking down a support pillar during their first battle trials. That had not been a case of too much power, but one of not taking into account the fact he had forgotten to reinforce his shoes for such an action. Whoops. Still, he was still doing better than 𝐲𝐻𝐸 had the last time around. Of course, the fact that Bakugo was no longer in the class likely helped as well. Still, the day of the break-in the last time around passed without incident besides of the press outside the front gates, which allowed the tension in his shoulders he had been carrying since he woke up to finally start to drain. The class had attempted to vote him as class rep before he annoyingly pointed out that he had not even been in the running since he very much did not want to have to deal with that shit if he didn't have to. As a result, Yaoyorozu replaced Iida as class rep, and Iida found himself the vice, which was frankly a better version of the combination of the two given both of their personalities. Still, that did nothing to loosen the worry in his gut when he woke the next day on the morning of the long-dreaded USJ trip. It didn't matter how much he told himself everything was going to be okay. He had nearly died defending his class that day and had borne the scars of it on his body up until he had woken up less than a year ago from his relative perspective. It wasn't until he registered that he was wrapped in the weighted blanket that they kept out in the living room that he realized he had worked himself up into a panic attack. His father, all for one, the one at least in part responsible for what happened to him, was gently rocking him and making soothing noises to try and calm him down while his mother sat down a cup of tea in front of him. Seemingly realizing he was aware of his surroundings again, she gave him a worried look. Do I need to call 𝐲𝐻𝐸 and let him know you aren't coming in today? Izuku shook his head. No, I need to be there today, to see that everyone is actually okay. 𝐻𝐸's father hummed. Something happened today the last time, didn't it? Something bad. Izuku shivered. The first proper attack by the League of Villains happened during our trip off the main campus to the unforeseen simulation joint. It was bad, but everyone came out alive that time, but only just. Tamura and the first Nama we knew about nearly killed me while I was fighting them. If it hadn't been for Erasure, Asui would have died. Tamura grabbed her face with all 5 fingers before 𝐲𝐻𝐸 knocked him away. The shock of what had happened that day really hit home as he allowed himself to process what had happened that day once more. More of my bones were broken at the end of the fight than were not, and I was left badly scarred, including one on my cheek from where my orbital ridge was fractured to the point of breaking the skin there. He traced a line on his cheek where the scar he had long grown used to over the year that he had it. I spent most of my time in the following weeks doing a mummy impersonation because Recovery Girl straight up couldn't help me heal any faster without killing me. Both of them had paled significantly by the time he had finished, and his father had tightened his hug significantly. Yeah, no, you are not going to school today. I don't care what you say. I am just not going to let you go for the rest of the day, I think. Izuku immediately folded without protest. Okay, sure, he had not really wanted to go to school that day, but it wasn't like he could just skip school on all the hard days that were coming up. Still, it probably was for the best. Okay, 𝐸𝐸𝐸𝐸. 𝐲𝐻𝐸 sighed as he hung up the phone and marked Izuku off for the day for mental health reasons on the attendance. A part of him was jealous that he had the option, even knowing that the USJ was probably horrifically worse for him than it had been for 𝐲𝐻𝐸. After all, he had been the one that had nearly died from his injuries, not 𝐲𝐻𝐸. Plus, this likely would have been the first time he had been back in the building since those injuries, given that they had never used the facility again after the attack, and obviously he had not been inside it since he woke up again. 𝐲𝐻𝐸, on the other hand, had been visiting the building at least once a year with his students since he had started teaching, as well as had used it when he had been a student himself. Still, every visit put his teeth on edge. He hated the place, and the memories of that first visit burned into his psyche. But it wasn't like he could avoid the place like he did the entrance exam. The exam, at least he had a damn good excuse as to why he felt sick at the idea of it that anyone could verify with a few minutes of time by talking to the right person. On the other hand, he could hardly say that the USJ just gave him that bad of vibes when he had a reputation of being cool in the face of a crisis. Honestly, if getting a building dropped on him twice was not enough to freak him out about the possibility, then why would such a nice training facility do it? Oboro came over and rubbed his shoulders as 𝐲𝐻𝐸 glared at the schedule for the day up on his computer before leaning over to whisper in his ear. You know 13 has been starting to worry that you don't like working with them from how you act every time you go to the USJ. Shouted down the last of his coffee before checking the room for potential eavesdroppers. Seeing that 𝐬𝐬 and 13 were also in the room, he replied in a soft whisper, "It is the place, not them. The USJ just puts me on edge." The fact that the past couple years 𝗵𝗲 had been there too had done nothing to help, even with the man in his hero costume. Danger sense thing. 𝐲𝐻𝐬 snorted. I wish. It would feel justified then. No, locations can't be hostile in a way that flags it. It works by sensing ill intent in an area. 𝗵𝗲 then allowed himself to raise his voice. Have you considered that the USJ might just be haunted? I mean, bad vibes like that could be a spirit at work. I am pretty sure that you would be more sensitive to that sort of thing than most everyone else who goes in there since, you know. That perked the other pair up. 𝐬𝐬 always one for juicy gossip and 13 given the subject matter. They did give 𝐲𝐻𝐬 a weird look at that though. Wait, you believe in ghosts? Isn't that, you know, illogical? 𝐲𝐻𝐬 snorted. Only when you are not actively being haunted by one. Given I have 8 of the things, I can't exactly live in denial. You have seen my hair move on its own before when I wasn't using my quirk, right? Most of the time that is one of said ghosts being extra affectionate and ruffling my hair. 𝐬𝐬 nodded, clearly thinking back to when he had been forced to reveal that to them in the hospital all those years ago. Yeah, he is not joking about that. We have seen the ghosts bodily move him enough times to prove it. I am not just talking about small stuff either. Once 𝐲𝐻𝐬 passed out on their couch after getting home from patrol and they literally picked him up and carried him to bed right in front of 𝗵𝗲 and his 𝗓𝐻𝐬. 𝐲𝐻𝐬 snorted, remembering the aftermath of that. Yeah, I am still impressed that my uncle 𝐬𝐻𝐬 managed to do that by himself. He wasn't exactly in fantastic physical shape when he died, despite also being a hero over in the States. That earned him a smack to the back of the head from said uncle. Rude. I was in great shape. �KATSUMI snorted. Yeah, for you maybe. 𝐲𝐻𝐬 has a point, and I still stand by the fact that I think that 𝐜𝐻𝐬 or Nana should have done it. You were really struggling at the end there and did nearly drop him multiple times. 𝐲𝐻𝐬 just shook his head at the pair of them bickering, as they had done more and more since the truth of �KATSUMI's lie came out. He was pretty sure that if his uncle could and would be able to never see him again, he might have divorced him by now. 13 gave him a strange look. So, there is a ghost over where you were just looking then. 𝐲𝐻𝐬 sighed and prepared to go and point around the room. 2 actually. My uncle 𝐬𝐻𝐬 and his husband �KATSUMI, who are fighting again. Over there by the window are 𝐜𝐻𝐬 and where they were probably watching that bird's nest again before I distracted them just now. 𝗬𝐬 looks like he is currently napping at Snipe's desk, and both Nana and 𝗬𝗲𝐬 are being nosy and trying to see what is on All Might's desk, despite the fact I am the only thing in the physical world they can interact with. It would be great if you could not mention the whole ghost thing, obviously. I have enough people thinking I am crazy without the whole haunted thing. 𝐬𝐬, thank God, switched the topic back to what was really important. So what, you and the ghosts just not like something about the USJ? 𝐲𝐻𝐬 sighed and leaned back in his chair. Yeah, basically. I can't tell you more than that though. 𝗵𝗲 gave him a skeptical look. If you want you could sit this one out. 𝐬𝐡𝐬 had to tap out for a mental health day, right? Why don't you go check on him? 𝐲𝐻𝐬 shook his head. No, I'll be fine. I would rather be able to keep an eye on all my problem children. Just don't expect me to be relaxed until we are all on the bus back. 𝐬𝐬 smirked at that. Oh, someone is attached. How unlike you, 𝐲𝐻𝐬. Nicknaming them already. 𝐲𝐻𝐬 would deny, blushing lightly at that. Both my son and younger brother are in the class. Of course I would get attached with them telling me about their new friends. Plus Tensei's younger brother too. 𝗵𝗲 lit up slightly at that. I know. It is so cute hearing Hitoshi talk all about his little group of extroverts that have won him over. 𝐲𝐻𝐬 did have to admit feeling some amusement at the fact that Hitoshi had replaced Kaken in what had been the Baka squad and seemed to be just as equally confused about the adoption into the group as Kaken had been, albeit more accepting of the adoption. It was interesting seeing the same friend groups forming again with the slight change in the class lineup. Monoma, surprisingly, had forced his way into Izuku's new friend group, much to Izuku's own clear confusion on the matter, much like Aoyama had later on with himself. It was also interesting watching things from the outside as he came to several startling realizations about his own group of friends. Looking back, with the exception of Asui, who he knew to be a lesbian, he was beginning to think all his friends might have had crushes on himself. Uraraka sure had one on Izuku, and, looking back, she was acting the same with his brother as she had with himself. A part of him wondered if he should warn her that Izuku was probably gay like himself, but unlike himself at the time, this Izuku likely already knew that. Well, he wished luck to Ada, Monoma, and later probably Todoroki in their dating Izuku endeavors. After all, it was unlikely Izuku would actually date one of them until they were all at least adults, since mental maturity reverted to new physical age or not. Izuku was cumulatively 46 years old at this point, as was 𝐲𝐸, even if he sure didn't feel like he was. There were many days he found himself shocked at how old he was even physically. He was nearly twice the age he had been when he died physically, and in a few years after that would be triple mentally. It was wild to think about at times, to remember just how young he had been when everything went to shit. But everything was fine now. He had fixed it. Today would be just fine at the USJ like it always had been in this timeline. 𝐸𝐸𝐸𝐸. As 𝐲𝐸 watched Namu after Namu appear from black sludge around 6 barely an hour later, 𝐲𝐸 cursed himself for jinxing it. There were villains in the USJ. Again, 6, because it had to be 6 from the combination of the rumored scar. His plain face and long black hair looked up at the group with a wild look. My, 10. I thought the doctor was lying when he said you were playing pretend as a hero, but here you are. Oh, what was the name? Oh right, Midoriya 𝐲𝐸. 𝐲𝐸 felt his muscles lock up as he suddenly became painfully aware that he was standing right next to All Might, a man who had only turned up on time for class this time around because of his own nagging of him. A fact that Oboro had clearly realized as well as he tried to quickly and forcefully warp the hero away. It was too late as All Might reflexively jumped back as clear horrified understanding flashed over his face. 𝐲𝐸 snapped his face around to Oboro. Get everyone out of here. Now, in a strange parody of the first USJ incident, Oboro blanketed all of the platform in his black mist as 𝐲𝐸 launched himself down at his brother and the Namu under the power of one for all, hoping to God that All Might would prioritize the monsters over himself. 𝐸𝐸𝐸𝐸. Hitoshi was suddenly very glad that his dads knew what the fuck to do because he sure didn't. One thing he was majorly relieved by was at least none of his classmates or 13 seemed to have fought his Odo-san's warp in the confusion. 13 snapped around to face his Odo-san. Loud Cloud, what the hell is going on? Where are Eraserhead and All Might? I'm sorry, but I will have to leave the explanation to Principal Nezu. Look after the rest of the class for us. He then pulled Hitoshi through another wrap gate to appear in the living room of his grandfather's apartment. Suddenly both his grandfather and Izuku were on their feet from where they had been sitting in a nest of blankets on the couch. Before either could ask, Odo-sen explained. 6 just appeared in the middle of the USJ and identified 𝐲𝐸 as 10 in front of All Might. I am going back to get Hisashi and try and rescue 𝐲𝐸 from the mess, but you all need to get ready to move since the moment All Might stops fighting 𝐲𝐸 he is going to realize who you are as well and realize that 𝐲𝐸 has been talking about you in the present tense and come here. Where's 𝐀𝐦? At the store, but we can grab her on the way to the safe house if need be. We are going to use the one on Coruscant Street so you can find us after the dust settles and we can warp on from there. Odo-san nodded at his grandfather's instructions and was gone, leaving him to start rushing about. Hitoshi, Izuku, we need to grab everything irreplaceable. Leave anything electronic that can be traced. Move. Unlike Hitoshi, who did not hesitate to move, Izuku sat there slightly dazed until Hitoshi came back with his backpack and emptied it out in front of him and shoved it into his hands. Izuku, we don't have time for you to freeze. You need to grab anything that All Might find that could incriminate you as a villain like Dad and Grandfather. That seemed to knock him into motion as he stumbled to his feet and practically flew to his bookcase to pull notebook after notebook from it before powering down his laptop and shoving it in as well, abandoning the power cord. Hitoshi meanwhile focused on shoving clothes into a duffel bag since none of his shit was there. He could only presume that his dads would handle that. His grandmother reappeared in the confusion and was quick to join the packing even if she seemed she was in the dark as to why they were running. She seemed to just trust that if all of them were clearly in agreement that they needed to, that it was likely necessary. 𝐸𝐸𝐸𝐸. Hisashi nearly jumped out his own skin when Oboro appeared in the middle of his English lecture with Class 1. Before he could remark, he saw the clear agitation in his husband's form. Reverb, 10's been burned by 6. We need to go. Hisashi immediately switched mental gears to the emergency plan that the two of them had created back when they had finally confirmed without a shadow of a doubt that their husband was a villain. Backing up or closing up shop. Closing, 10 ordered in evac. Sensei, what is going on? Hisashi cast a worried look at the class. Kurogiri, did he give you any instructions for what to do here? Negative. Well, that was a relief. Hisashi turned to the class. I need your class representative to run to the teacher's lounge for me and get your homeroom teacher. I am afraid our lesson for today has been cancelled, as will all others that followed. He internally sighed. Damn it, he had really liked being a teacher too. Poor 𝐲𝐸 and the boys though. They had seemed to really like 1A. As soon as one of the students stepped up to comply, Hisashi disappeared through Oboro's mist as they warped home so he could begin packing. I am going back to try and help him if I can. We are meeting the others at the safe house on Coruscant Street and warping to the final safe house location from there. Hisashi quickly grabbed him to pull him in for a quick kiss. Remember, 𝐲𝐸 getting captured, while not ideal, would not be the end of the world. We'll just bust him out later. Only risk it if you get a clear shot to grab him or if All Might is going for the kill. Oboro pressed his forehead against Hisashi's. Help keep our son safe in case I get grabbed too. And then he was gone again. 𝐸𝐸𝐸𝐸, he decided, was probably going to kill Six, after he interrogated him about the doctor though. Still, of all the ways he had been expecting All Might to find out who he was, having it happen so abruptly at UA of all places was a complete nightmare. It could have only gone worse had 𝗵𝗲𝗄 not been with him to get all the possible people who would have been collateral in this three-way fight out of the way to safety. He had to wonder, however, how much the doctor himself had thought this planned attack through as 𝐜𝐡𝐢 ripped quirk copy after quirk copy from what amounted to monstrous cannon fodder. After all, copies, as he had long since realized, had no ghosts attached to them and were basically free game to collect. 𝐜𝐡𝐬 was just opening his mouth in front of him to give a shout of warning as danger sense flared when 𝐜𝐡𝐢 found a fist colliding with his face courtesy of Six before he crashed into the ground. Snarling, 𝐜𝐡𝐢 slammed his hand on the floor and sent up a flurry of spikes courtesy of 𝗓𝗏 trying to impale his brother only for him to vanish again just as fast as he had appeared. Right, overclock, before he could allow himself to focus on that chase. He found himself rolling and leaping up to his feet as he dodged an incoming blow from All Might. He hissed slightly in annoyance at the man. Really, such a target-rich environment and you are still after me? Glad to see you have your priorities straight, All Might. The fury in All Might's eyes was a punch to the gut even having known it was coming. What is your game, 10? You have been toying with me pretending we were friends. Were you just planning on getting close to better stab me in the back? 𝐜𝐡𝐢 had to fight the instinct to flare erasure at the man as doing so would have been his death sentence. God damn it, All Might, we are friends. Can we please do this after we deal with the horde of monsters that Six brought into a school full of children? Six from his perch atop the fountain in the middle of the courtyard area between zones began a slow clap. Oh, the doctor was right. This is a good show. I mean, I knew there would be drama when the truth came out, 10, with how he has been clearly hunting you, but this is way better than I was expecting. I regret not bringing popcorn. 𝐜𝐡𝐢 launched himself at his fellow clone with a combination of one for all, 𝐷𝗀 and gearshift, but missed entirely as he radically overshot Six, who had just used overclock to dodge. However, now he was close enough. Before he could even touch down, he blanketed the area using smokescreen with the knowledge that overclock's effectiveness was tied directly to the user's ability to breathe, much like his other father's jet. It should slow him down some and had the added benefit of temporarily hiding him from All Might. 𝐜𝐡𝐢 had to resist the urge to give a small noise of pleasure as he pulled more quirks into himself as he wove through the crowd of confused Namu. This scenario likely rendering their already given instructions moot. It was like scratching an itch at the back of his mind that had been slowly bothering him more and more since he had stolen 𝗓𝗏 all those years before. The feeling of giving into the urge was heady, and it was getting harder and harder to leave the original quirk copies and the living corpses behind as he pulled the other quirk copies free. No, it was like drinking water for the first time after being stranded in a hot desert. Like eating a full meal for the first time after weeks of starving. Suddenly, for the first time since he had learned about All for One, he understood. Understood how his father had become such a monster. Understood why the original All for One had been such an all-consuming poison to Tamura's mind. The quirk couldn't care less about whether or not other people got hurt. The quirk was an all-consuming hunger to feed. And now that he was unsure if he would be able to stop. 𝐸𝐸𝐸𝐸. Yoichi gave a small pain cry as he watched his nephew as he began to fall apart internally at the seams as quirk after quirk flowed into their shared quirk. As One for All continued to feed off the quirks that All for One was feeding it. As he and the other vestiges were washed back into the void of the quirk-created mindscape between both All for One and One for All. The only reason they were not completely washed away to drown in the depths of the new sea of lights was Deku quickly using Black Whip to grab all of them and anchor them on their little island floating above it. It only took a brief momentary exchange of looks with the other holders to see that his realization of what was happening to 𝐜𝐡𝐢 had not escaped them. The realization that in just moments that they had failed in their self-imposed quest to help keep their ninth from falling as Yoichi's own brother had, to help him stay on his path as a hero. Now though, as corpses fell into the sea alongside the sparks of power, they knew that their 𝐜𝐡𝐢 was never going to come back from this, that nothing they could do would stop him. Kai, who as he had mellowed, had begun to grow on them as one of their own, slammed his hand down on the island and forced it into a new reinforced glass-roofed form that blocked the tide from washing them away before swatting at Deku. You can let go now. Sorry. The black tendrils that had been anchoring them all together fell apart, and with them, Yoichi's ability to hold himself together. He stumbled over to anchor himself upright, holding the back of his seat in their little semicircle of 8 chairs before he found himself falling apart as a crazed laughter began to escape him with tears falling from his eyes. Katsumi growled as he stared up to watch the lights and corpses crash into the transparent roof. I told you we should have just killed him after what happened with Yaga's vestige. That he was just a ticking time bomb. Yoichi's breathing stopped as something in him just snapped as he launched himself at his former love full of a heart-stopping rage. He crashed into 𝐷𝗲𝐺 with full killing intent. There were cries of alarm around them as 𝐬𝐻𝐸 wrapped his hand around the man's neck with the full power of One for All, locking his fingers tight and began to squeeze. He barely registered as the others around him jumped in to try and desperately pull them apart as he felt the satisfying pops of crushing the man's windpipe and breaking his spine under his fingers. 𝐬𝐻𝐸 stopped moving. Everyone collectively froze as the life faded from his eyes. His face now froze in a look of pure fear. As 𝐬𝐻𝐸 released him, unlike every other time that one of them had hurt another, the damage stayed put. He stayed dead. 𝐬𝐻𝐸 stood up from the cooling corpse that was blurring at the edges like those of the quirks from the 𝗁𝗏, a memory of the person who the quirk had been but lacking their soul. His friends were staring at him in open fear, a couple even taking a nervous couple steps back. 𝐬𝐻𝐸 was torn from feeling hurt and wallowing in the grim satisfaction of what he had just done. Kai did not seem daunted as he approached and placed his hand on the ground of the island and dropped what had been the second to fall into the sea with the others. At the disgust of the boy's actions that Nana shot him, Kai returned the glare. I am not going to sit around with a corpse if I don't have to. Taoyami, however, just stared at 𝐬𝐻𝐸 in a dazed sort of shock. You killed him. 𝐬𝐻𝐸 stared at him unflinchingly. Yes. Taoyami took another nervous step back from his gaze, invoking a sense of twisted personal pride as the man stared at him in open fear. I thought. You loved him. 𝐬𝐻𝐸 huffed. I did at one point, yes. Taoyami, he wanted to kill 𝐲𝗏. He realized that I could never have allowed that. Not only would that have killed 𝐲𝗏 but all of us as well. 𝐬𝐻𝐸 shook his head. Even setting that aside, while yes, there is no coming back from the cliff that 𝐲𝗏 has fallen head first off of, he is still hardly a monster for becoming more like my brother. We have all seen what my brother is truly like, and compared to the monsters created from his corpse in the last timeline, he is hardly even a concern. Plus 𝐲𝗏 is not so far gone to be irredeemable. If he was, Toshinori would already be dead, so he wasn't fighting two sides at once. Nana looked slightly ill as she fell into her chair. You realize what this all means, right? 𝐲𝗏 has stated point blank in the past that we would only be able to permanently hurt one another if he allowed it. He allowed first to kill Katsumi. 𝐬𝐻𝐸 suppressed a flinch at her use of his title over his name, something none of them had done in the years after 𝐲𝗏 settled into being 𝐲𝗏. Deku rubbed the back of his neck. Shit, he knew that we were going to fight about this, huh? What better way to deal with angry ghosts that would attack him later but have us deal with them? That cheered up 𝐬𝐻𝐸 immensely. Us? The man gave a sheepish smile. Let's just say I probably would have done the same thing to second if you hadn't beaten me to it. I might be the tiniest bit attached, fledgling supervillain or no. Kai snorted. I think you made that painfully obvious when you threatened to kill me for even looking at 𝗀. 𝐬𝐻𝐸 considered the boy who was standing with his hands in his pockets as his hives from Deku grabbing him earlier began to fade to stop himself from clawing at them. He was probably among some of the most relaxed of them, as if a fight between all of them wasn't on the verge of breaking out. You don't want to try and kill him any more then? Kai shook his head. Even if doing so would return me to the other me, which it wouldn't, I probably would rather stay here at this point. As much as I miss my old life at times, as odd as it might sound, this life has just sort of been better. For me at least. My mysophobia is at least far more manageable when the only people who can touch me are you all and I am incorporeal most of the time. That earned the kid some sympathetic looks from most of them. Deku snorted. Damn, no wonder you are so much more chill than Chisaki was. You're just here living your best ghost life, huh? He shrugged before seeming to consider something as he fell into what had become his chair over the years since he had been trapped with them. Before you killed him, 𝐬𝐻𝐸 mentioned something about a vestige of Yagi. What was that about? Just when 𝐬𝐻𝐸 thought the mood could not go any lower, the silence crashed over them as all of the previous holders were forced to acknowledge the loss that they had been pointedly ignoring for decades, and sighed, breaking the silence before gesturing at the seat that Kai had claimed as his own. Your seat was not originally your own. There were originally 8 of us sent back with 𝐲𝗏 but Yagi. He was never a true vestige, more of an after-image of the holder before 𝐲𝗏 burned into the stockpiler that originally combined with 𝐬𝐻𝐸's transference. I'm not sure what happened to the vestige that had originally made up the quirk since they were missing when it was given to 𝐬𝐻𝐸, but given how we have seen all for one work now, I can only presume he was burned away before passed to him to protect 𝐬𝐻𝐸 from them possibly lashing out. All Might was the first besides 𝐜𝐡𝐦 to hold the quirk for any substantial amount of time and eventually overwrote the aspects it had picked up from him in favor of the one who held it for 40 years. By the time the quirk found itself in 𝐲𝗏's hands, it had fully developed a personality mirroring that of the original Yagi and clearly was in tune with the man's feelings, including the paternal ones that he had developed for 𝐲𝗏. 𝐲𝗏 did not wake up all at once in the past, despite what his memories might tell him, but over the course of several stressful hours as he was dragged kicking and screaming back from the dead. We think that in his confusion he didn't recognize Yagi when he tried to help comfort him and lashed out violently. Yagi was ripped to shreds before any of us could do anything to save him. 𝐜𝐡𝐦 messaged his forehead, his silence thus far likely caused by his migraine at least in part. When 𝐲𝐸 woke up properly after the fact, we quickly realized that not only did he block out the memories between his death and waking up, but completely erased all traces of Yaga's vestige from his mind. Despite knowing that there should have been another vestige from the number of quirks he held, he seemed to refuse to acknowledge the fact that one of our number was missing. In fact, he so certainly conflated the quirk that had once been Yagi with Yoichi that he actually tied the ambient power directly to him and forged them into one quirk for real. This, reasonably, left Second terrified of 𝐲𝐸 even before we had confirmation of our fears that he had been reborn into the body of a clone of All for One. While he was most certainly playing nice with 𝐲𝐸, clearly from his less than tasteful joke about helping you kill him in his sleep, he never really dropped the idea of trying to kill him from back then. Yoichi felt his hackles start to lower as he realized that none of the man's nervous watching for an attack was directed at himself but at Toonami, despite knowingly broadcasting his own aggression towards those that would have sided with 𝐵𝑃𝑃𝑗 against 𝐲𝐸. That made 4 confirmed on their side to the remaining 3 unknown. Of the 3, Toonami was the most likely to act as an enemy, but he could not write off Nana or En, the former of which had been conflicted about her feelings towards 𝐲𝐸 for years at this point, and the latter was like trying to read a brick wall from how little he emoted on things. Still, even if all 3 were against them, they not only outnumbered them but likely had the better combination of quirks. Yoichi looked around at his allies and possible enemies and made a decision. We should decide once and for all where we all stand to prevent something like this from happening again. I would vastly prefer to know for the future when 𝐲𝐸 does inevitably take a quirk that wants to fight back against him like Kai did but is not afraid to back down, that we are all fighting to defend 𝐲𝐸 and each other and not pretending to go along with things to build up a new group of allies to come and stab us all in the backs. Toonami no, he was Sansei, wasn't he? Sansei only paled more as hostilities spiked. You can't be seriously be asking what I think you are. You want us to just admit that we might have agreed slightly with Katsumi and what, just let you kill us? En snorted. No, he is asking you if you would choose to side against all of us to try would kill 𝐲𝐸 even knowing that it would kill all of us, or if you want to protect him as our holder and thus all of us. You have to realize that the former is literally suicide if you succeed. Because of that, if you still stand with him, why would us killing you really matter? After all, both ways would end with your death. You have to kill me. The silence that washed over them as Shimura Nana looked Yoichi dead in the eyes was deafening at her words. Yoichi could see the resignation in her eyes as she continued. I can't keep doing this, pretending. I love 𝐲𝐸, I really do. But I love Toshinori too, and I would never be able to stand back and watch 𝐲𝐸 kill my son. Not again. Yoichi felt a tightness in his throat but gave a nod of understanding. One that was mirrored around the group even as tears welled up in their eyes. Unlike most of them, this wasn't just about self-preservation and protecting their last tie to the living. She still had other people to protect that could get hurt. It was Kai who stepped forward, though with clear understanding reflected in his eyes, to hold out a hand. I'll make it fast. 𝐸𝐸𝐸𝐸. 𝐲𝐸 felt so alive as he pulled the limbs off another Namu as easily as if he was plucking the wings off a butterfly. He knew that morally he had probably just done the equivalent of jumping off a cliff at some point during what was turning into a massacre at his hands as he hunted his brother in the phosphorus haze and danced around all might. He had pulled the pigments from both his hair and clothes to better blend in the billowing white a while ago, but now was stained a deep red from the blood, having given up the losing battle of keeping himself blood-free. As he dropped the arms to leave another of the sorry creatures to bleed out, he absently noted that living ones were becoming harder to come across. In fact, 𝐲𝐸 activated the shiny new copy of thermal vision and looked around through the cloud. He felt a small spike of disappointment that the fun had indeed come to an end. Only 3 other actively moving heat signatures remained standing. 6 had slipped back up to his perch atop the fountain at some point it seemed and was frantically scanning the smoke around him to dodge 𝐲𝐸's next attempt. All Might seemed to be picking his way through the trail of bodies trying to trace his own path through the destruction, likely to try and grab him. The last signature could have only been his 𝗲𝗲, though, since it was like a hole of ice cold in the vague shape of a body lurking out the peripheral from the window of one of the buildings of the ruins, likely to help him escape when he finished. 𝐲𝐸 would have to head in his direction after he finally grabbed his brother. His brother who had finally made a mistake he could exploit. 𝐲𝐸 dropped lower into the smoke after sending out a fresh wave to ensure his movements remained unseen and slowly and carefully crept up to the fountain, stepping silently through the air using float to hide his footsteps. Finally, he hovered just below his brother over the waters of the fountain and slowly and silently raised a hand. The mistake 6 had made. He was still ankle deep in the smoke and all 𝐲𝐸 needed was to make skin-to-skin contact. 6 yelped in surprise as 𝐲𝐸's hand closed around his ankle like a vice as he both ripped his fellow clone from his perch and the quirks from his body. There was what would have previously been a sickening crack as his head collided with the stonework on the way down that merely was a disappointment for 𝐲𝐸 to hear now as the body went limp and ragdolled into the water. No matter, it would be easy enough to fix the damage so he could draw things out and get the information he needed. Unfortunately, as he allowed himself to be distracted with preparing to possibly practice necromancy again, he failed to register the slightly increased spike in danger sense until All Might's fist knocked him hard enough that he flew out of the cloud to crash back on the top steps leading from the entrance down to the courtyard. It was more annoying than painful at this point, thankfully. He had taken far too many copies of shock absorption for any sort of blunt force damage to even really register. All Might had only succeeded in knocking him free like that purely because he had been using float and thus ungrounded enough to still be knocked away despite them. He was climbing to his feet with the plan of grabbing his brother and finally taking his leave when the doors to the USJ flew open with a new spike of danger from Danger Sense as 𝐲𝐻𝐸 saw the familiar flash of Snipe's muzzle before pain erupted from his shoulder. Fear rippled over him as he realized that any hesitation the man could have had in possible confusion for what was going on had been negated by the fact that he had not recognized 𝐲𝐻𝐸 in his current appearance and had only seen an unknown figure covered in blood before reacting accordingly. 𝐲𝐻𝐸 desperately fumbled with his new quirks to try and find Overclock to try and outrun the shots coming, but it was too late as another blow struck true in the leg and the quirk suppressants and sedatives lacing the bullets began to rack his system, slowing him down further. His vision blurred as bullet after bullet hit him in non-vital areas, Snipe clearly aiming for capture. He crumpled as his vision swam. Realizing that there was no way out of this right now, he sent a mental apology to 𝗵𝗲 watching and the rest of his family as he stopped fighting and allowed the drugs to take hold. He just hoped that 𝗵𝗲 would prioritize going home to their husband and son over risking getting caught himself. Darkness. 𝐀𝐦 stared down at the crumpled and bloodied form of 𝐲𝐻𝐸 in pure shock as he was being transferred to a stretcher for his arrest. It wasn't as if she could pretend otherwise despite him now lacking his signature dyed hair. A fact that had thrown most all of them when they had stepped through the doors of the USJ to see his form drenched in blood. Nezu had warned them that they should be prepared to fight him when they arrived in the wake of the disappearances of 𝗵𝗲, Hisashi, and their kid, likely signaling that the man was preparing to cut ties and go full villain on them, but none of them had believed it. After all, this was 𝐲𝐻𝐸 they were talking about. Mr. I will throw myself into the line of fire to save anyone, 𝐲𝐻𝐸. And now, apparently, slaughter over 50 people in minutes, 𝐲𝐻𝐸. She felt sick as the smoke that had blanketed over the massacre when they arrived began to dissipate to reveal the gory aftermath and the still extremely freaked out All Might, who was now eyeing all of them in open suspicion in the wake of this sudden betrayal. Okay, sure, they had all been villains who had broken into the school facility, but what had they done to deserve this? The situation was made worse after they fished the corpse from the fountain waters, as 𝐀𝐦 was shocked to see a man who could have easily been mistaken for 𝐲𝐻𝐸 had it not been for the massive scar torn across his face. What the hell was going on here? 𝐸𝐸𝐸𝐸. Naomasa stared down at the cuffs on his wrists, slightly baffled as Sansa awkwardly read him his rights. He was not exactly sure what was happening. He had heard the charges being leveraged against him, sure, but hearing and comprehending were two completely different things. I'm sorry, but 𝐲𝐻𝐸 did what? Sansa just gave him a look of pity. They don't have an exact death toll yet since they are still picking up the pieces, but over 50 dead have been confirmed with All Might as a witness. For once, Naomasa wished his quirk would have rated him for quirk suppression cuffs, as the truth of that statement rattled him. I'm sorry, but with how close you were with him and all other known close associates having vanished, we have to hold you until you have been cleared of any suspicion of collaboration or covering up other previous crimes. Truth, especially in the wake of All Might accusing you of having known Midoriya, 𝐲𝐻𝐸, and the villain 10 were one and the same. Truth. 𝐸𝐸𝐸𝐸. It didn't take long for the reporters to catch wind of the story and for it to spread. For the revelation that one of the most prominent underground heroes and leading hero school teachers had been a villain in disguise. One that would have continued to lurk undetected and unseen at the heart of the hero community had an apparent rival faction not revealed his identity. One that had so thoroughly corrupted the two heroes whose voices had been shaping the youth of the country with their radio broadcasts for over a decade and had vanished under the villain's orders with his family. A man that, when he was arrested, was stained a bloody crimson from his slaughter. Every hero who had ever been taught by the man was under suspicion now. Every hero from UAS Class 1A for over a decade was now under review, as well as the current 3A classes. 193 currently rostered heroes, both Limelight and Underground, and 47 students. Mirio couldn't help but think it was all bullshit. He, of course, would never had said as much aloud, but he sure as hell was thinking it as he sat waiting for the HPSC investigators to finish with Tamaki. His friend, who had been practically shaking like a leaf as 𝐓𝐡𝐢𝐬 guided him into the interview despite the hero's protests about the necessity for it. It wasn't fair for both him and 𝐀𝐦 to be so heavily under suspicion for no reason, and for him to not be just because they had always had different homeroom teachers. Sure, it would have been one thing for him to have been cleared by the sheer luck of having been chosen by All Might as an intern and possible future successor to the title of Symbol of Peace. But he knew that had he had Midoriya-sensei as his teacher, he would have been in the same boat after he heard about the detective that All Might had mentioned on the odd occasion as a former friend being arrested and charged with collaboration. He had only actually heard about it because Sir had been so disturbingly smug about that fact. It was because all of this had apparently just proven that he and All Might had been right to worry about 10 from the start. While the detective had decided to have faith that his other friend was truly a hero despite them having heard of him stealing a quirk from some random Yakuza teen. Given that the man had a lie detection quirk, Mirio was inclined to think that, at the time, the detective had probably been right, especially if what he had heard about events from the couple 1N 1E students he had asked was true. The man leading the attack on the school had revealed the hero's identity in front of the one person at the school at the time who would have heard the name 10 and jumped to calling him a villain. Mirio couldn't help but wonder if things would have gone so badly had the man not been backed so far into a corner by the one hero he had apparently feared, �loud_Cloud, or possibly Kurogiri. Now if the 1E student he had talked to was to be believed, had said that 6 had burned 10, which could explain the level of aggression he had shown in kind, because it had not just been 10's life that had been ruined but the simple reveal but every life he had ever touched, including that of the man's younger brother Midoriya Izuku. The boy that had been intended to be All Might's successor in a different sort of way, inheriting his quirk and its legacy as Mirio took the mantle of a symbol to divide the burden. Apparently, Sir was still kicking himself about that fact, given it had been him who had basically been responsible for handing the world's most powerful quirk to the villains on a silver platter. Because that was just the thing. When the dust had settled slightly and they were able to take a step back and take stock, they came to the worrying realization that the villain that had so badly injured All Might that he had needed to look for a successor in the first place was not as dead as they had believed. That despite literally punching the man's brains out on the pavement, he was apparently still alive, from how both Midoriyas had referred to him in the present tense. Alive and with access to one for all on top of his one all for one. Mirio could only hope that the two heroes were overreacting. The Midoriya kid at least had sounded nice enough from what he had heard about him so far, so maybe this was all a massive misunderstanding. Who was he kidding? Misunderstanding or not, Midoriya-sensei had fully crossed a major line and there was no coming back from that. Murder was murder. There was no getting around the fact the man had killed so many people. He felt sorry for the two younger teens that had ended up accidentally caught up in all of this. Nezu had never before been so relieved to not be human. It likely was the only thing keeping him from being crucified as a follower of 10 right now. In the wake of Tsukachi's arrest, the HPSC had robbed themselves of access to the one quirk that could detect if he was lying after all. Not that he suspected that the detective wouldn't have covered for him had he himself not been arrested first. After all, he was just as much an ally to the fallen hero as the detective had been. This had not been a possibility he himself had accounted for. 10 getting caught, sure, that had been enviable from the start. No, what caught him off guard was the guilt for not doing more to help protect the man from this sort of circumstance. He had accidentally allowed himself to get attached, a feat that he would have laughed at the notion of 16 years before, when he had first been told of the connection between 10 and All for One, before he had grown to know the boy turned hero and now turned villain. While none of the species that individually made up his messy genetic code were communal animals by nature, that did not erase the fact that he thrived just as much from human interaction as any human. It had not stopped him from forming his own little family group of sorts at UA, with the students acting as his and the other staff's children that his instincts screamed at him to keep safe. 10 had changed from one of his kids to a possible invading viper to a trusted burrowmate ready to help defend their home and kids from outside threats. And he had done his job beautifully, even if the other humans refused to see it as such. When backed into a corner by two possible enemies, he immediately targeted the ones that could have gone on to hurt the students he had sworn to protect over the one that had been the true threat to his continued safety. After all, he easily could have killed All Might or even just temporarily deactivated his quirk and left him at the mercies of the other villains and then lied about what had happened as the sole survivor of the fight. But he had spared the man because 10 was at his heart still a good person, mass murder now or not. Though as the data began to roll in on the identities of those he had slaughtered, Nezu was finding himself wondering if that was even true, as 10's claim of them having all been monsters began to ring as true. After all, was it murder to destroy reanimated stolen corpses? As far as 6 was concerned, given that the man had died ultimately from drowning while unconscious after 10 had evidently knocked the man out in the fountain, his death was frankly more in Yaga's hands than anyone else's, since he had likely knocked 10 away before he could fish him back out and then left him submerged for dead. A fact that he was glad that Sir 𝐸𝐸 seemed to be preventing from getting back to him, with how the man was currently unbalanced by the perceived betrayal that had shattered his trust in basically everyone but Sir. With how unstable the heroics industry stood in Japan right now, the last thing they needed was for the symbol of peace to openly break in front of the people, whether that be by his current health being revealed, him having a full mental breakdown, or something far worse. Toshinori felt slightly guilty, as the first thought when he saw Tsukachi was that the man looked terrible. This at least was in part his own fault after all. If he hadn't mentioned that the man had known the identity of Ten and refused to tell him in his shock and anger at what had occurred nearly a week ago now, he likely would not have been trapped in jail while his trial was arranged. Jails, at the best of times, were not places that police detectives were supposed to be trapped for extended periods of time. Like heroes, cops made enemies of the villains they arrested, and with Tsukachi's quirk, well, he had closed a lot of cases. A lot of cases that were being reopened and reviewed in the wake of the discovery of his own corruption. Tsukachi was at least not physically injured that he could see, but it was painfully obvious he had not been sleeping well since his arrest. His eyes were dull when they met his own. All might. The HPSC investigator huffed and gestured for Toshinori to take the seat next to herself as she finished setting up the polygraph. I believe I don't have to explain how one of these works for you, Mr. Tsukachi. The man's eye twitched slightly at the title of Mr. My sister's quirk literally is registered as polygraph. Obviously not. Right, if we could get a proper baseline from you. Name, quirk, occupation, and then a couple obvious lies. Detective Tsukachi Naomasa of this police division. My quirk is called lie detector and tells me if a statement someone says is true or false based on whether or not they believe it to be true. It is a passive mental emitter type class. As for the lies, the sky is actually green and the moon is a secret government satellite. Oh, and I love my coffee black. That last one got him a puzzled look before Toshinori cleared his throat. Generally he prefers lattes or a strong tea over black coffee. That earned a nod of acceptance. All right, let's begin simply. How long have you known Midoriya 𝐬𝐴, the pro hero Eraserhead, and Ten were in fact the same individual? Since about 7 hours after I heard about the rumor that a villain had jumped a rich kid for his quirk about 11 years ago. Gran Torino knew who it was immediately after hearing the rumor and went and confronted him about it and decided that 𝐬𝐴 knew what he was doing and that we all should drop it. Neither All Might nor Sir Night-Eye agreed, but he refused to say who Ten was since he knew that 𝐬𝐴 was terrified that All Might here would attack him at that revelation just because of the identity of his primary genetic donor. From what I've heard since about what happened, it sounds like he was right to be afraid. Pause for a second and back up. Genetic donor. 𝐬𝐴 was cloned with All for One's DNA as a base. I think he said he was an 80/20 split between both his fathers as a result. Before you ask, the other 20% was from Gran Torino from what I have been told, which is why in part he knew to ask 𝐬𝐴 about the incident in the first place. It was because of the connection that he had admitted to that day that raised the issue of if his judgment of the situation could be trusted or not. Seeing that tensions were rising in the group, I offered to act as a middleman to judge the situation myself, with the deal that if I thought the situation was under control like Gran Torino did, that they would drop the investigation in favor of the one that 𝐬𝐴 had offered to them as an olive branch. We all agreed in Gran Torino and I left. About halfway to 𝐬𝐴's apartment he told me who it was and left, knowing that I already knew how to get there myself. I met with 𝐬𝐴 and at the time he told me honestly that he had no intention of going around redistributing quirks like All for One and that taking overhaul was an exception to the norm. We have full evidence that last statement isn't true. Every single one of the bodies from the USJ was genetically tested and came up quirkless. Tsukachi sighed. It's not true now. Yes, but at the time he truly had no intention of becoming a villain proper. And what reason did he give for taking overhaul was acceptable in your book? He nodded. He told me point blank that one of the reasons he took it was because he was trying to save Sir Night-Eye's life. He fully believed that had the quirk remained in its original owner's hands, that Sir would die because of it. Toshinori flinched back. That was not something that had ever come up before. He was about to open his mouth to question this when he was struck by a thought and snapped it shut. They hadn't really allowed him to get a word in edgewise when he came back after he had said the quirk was better where it was. From the pointed look Tsukachi gave him, he was well aware of that fact. The HPSC investigator, however, gave him a slightly baffled look. And why was he so sure of that? Tsukachi looked thoughtful about something for a moment. About 1 year and maybe 7 weeks from now in what is now an alternate timeline. All for One used a quirk to send both 𝐬𝐴's and his brother Izuku's memories back in time to apparently stop everything falling apart at the seams. I am talking much worse than what is probably going on right now in wake of his arrest, but entire cities wiped off the map. At the time I only had 𝐬𝐴's word that everything happened, but his brother Izuku has woken up since and confirmed everything, including Sir Night-Eye's death, which both of them witnessed the first go-around since Izuku was interning with Sir at the time of the incident. As Tsukachi finally got to explain his reasoning behind his decision to have faith in Ten to behave himself and leave him be, Toshinori's chest tightened in horror of the things that Ten had let slip about this alternate timeline over the past decade to his once friend. It was halfway through his explanation to what had happened to his own mentor's grandson without Ten tricking 𝐴ll-for-one into interfering for him that he had the horrifying realization that Yagi Toshinori was the primary reason for the man's fall from grace. Every villainous action he had partaken in had been reactionary to himself outside the first. When he stumbled out of the room in a daze hours later, it was with the horrifying realization that he had done more to turn Ten into the next 𝐴ll-for-one than 𝐴ll-for-one himself had. For the first time since he lost it, Toshinori was glad he didn't have a stomach. If he had, he would have thrown up. 𝐸𝐸𝐸𝐸. Sorahiko slightly as he reread the paper directions he had gotten from the info broker he had hunted down in the wake of 𝐲𝐸𝐬's arrest and his own attempted one. He wasn't bad with directions, but his knowledge about nature being as limited as it was, half of the instructions were practically Greek to him. What the hell was a larch or a 𝐍𝐸𝐬? Well, from context, they were probably plants of some sort, but beyond that, he was lost. Like really lost at this point. He had been roaming the forest likely in circles for close to 3 days now, desperately hoping to find some sort of landmark. Find anyone. Hell, he would probably have cried in relief at this point if he was found by one of the heroes trying to arrest him. Or hell, he might have even kissed that asshole Hisashi in relief if he found him. He was tired, hungry, and extremely dehydrated at this point. His one bottle of water that he had stolen was long empty. If he died out here, he was coming back and haunting the shit out of Toshi for sending the other heroes after him. My, you look rather lost. Sorahiko startled so badly from the voice from seemingly nowhere that he accidentally reflexively got airborne. He quickly scanned his surrounding before his gaze found a man wearing one of the most ridiculous outfits for the time of year he had seen, with his large orange coat and a black and white patterned mask. Oh dear, I didn't mean to startle you. You would be Gran Torino, correct? Jiren called us a couple days ago to warn us that you were heading our way, but when you never showed up, some of our other former heroes started to worry, so we have been trying to figure out where you were since. Oh, this must be one of 𝐸's recruits. Yea, his voice cracked and cut off from the dehydration. Thankfully, the man seemed to realize the issue and fished out a bright blue marble that with a snap of the fingers was replaced with a bottle of water. Here, you are probably pretty dehydrated. Why don't you drink that and I will take us back to the cabins. Do you mind if I compress you to carry you back faster? Half the water bottle now gone, he lowered it to shake his head. I might still be in great shape for my age, but I am not built for walking for so long. Go for it. The man bobbed his head in a manner that reminded Sorahiko of an excited bird before reaching out and touching him with his hand. There was a disorientation rush of air around him before he momentarily blacked out, only to come out of it to fall into a familiar pair of arms. 𝐴ll-for-one looked down at him with open concern before looking up again. Thank you, Mr. Compress, for finding him. You can go call the rest of the search party off now. Sorahiko twisted his head around to see the strange man dip into a performer's bow holding before spinning around and leaving. With him now gone, the attention shifted fully back to Sorahiko. Are you all right? You have been missing for a while. Sorahiko whacked him and immediately felt much better. Put me down. I'm just tired and hungry from getting turned around from the piss-poor instructions your info broker gave me. What the hell is a larch? 𝐴ll-for-one gave an amused huff but lowered him to the ground and pointed to a nearby tree. That is a larch. Do you really not know what one of the most common species of trees in Japan looks like? I knew you preferred city life, but I didn't know you were that bad about nature, or I would have taken you camping at some point. Sorahiko grimaced at the thought. Whatever. Did my grandson get here safe at least? Our grandson, and yes, he arrived with me. Itoshi was helping with the search for you actually, so it might be a bit before you see him since Mr. Compress is running the message you've been found out on foot. Once he finds Izuku, the word should get out a bit faster, but we are lacking in the speed-related quirks department right now outside of myself, and I can't go too far from the camp or my quirk I am using for signal interference would no longer be protecting the camp. Why not give it to someone else for a bit? I would love to, but the only option for who I could give it to safely currently would be 9, and the two of us are taking it in 12-hour shifts so we can sleep and leave camp for a couple hours each day. I think you can guess what he is currently preoccupied with. Sorahiko frowned but nodded in acceptance of that. I suppose that is fair enough. I assume you haven't given him the speed quirk for a similar reason. Exactly. Sorahiko looked around the small collection of cabins in the middle of nowhere. You're not worried that the heroes will trace you here then? Financially. His ex-husband shook his head and gestured to the oldest cabin. The land originally belonged to the 4th holder of One for All. When he died, he left the land and his cabin to the 5th, but he never ended up using it, so it slipped his mind to transfer it to the 6th, so it was easy enough to forge paperwork that he left it to one Shinomori Hisashi. Since my alias had the same family name as the owner before him, the government clerk didn't bat an eye at it. So long as I continue to pay the taxes and pull random amounts for bills and food every week from the fully legal bank account I have set up for the identity, there is no reason anyone who looks at it would see anything other than a guy renting out his land regularly for campers. I have been planning on arranging a transfer over to a new identity of 𝐀𝐦 𝐍𝐴 soon, since I made the fake identity for him back when I first found him, and it has been around long enough that the heroes wouldn't flag it as suspicious activity. And the fact that you would be sort of returning the land to the ghost of the fourth is just a nice bonus, I expect. 𝐬𝐶 shrugged. I doubt he would complain about it. Come on, let's get you something to eat and get you to bed. 𝐲𝐴 was not sure what exactly was going on around him when he woke. His head hurt as danger sense screamed at him to run, but his limbs were not responsive. There was nervous murmuring that cleared to proper Japanese in waves. Sure that. Enough. ... more. Lethal dose. Still moving. Sedative. He felt something prick his skin in the crook of his elbow on his right arm before cold flowed into his veins. As he faded, he realized those voices had been familiar. Nem. He was gone again. 𝐸𝐸𝐸𝐸. The next time he remembered waking, it was to the feeling of his skin being harshly scrubbed. He cracked open his eyes ever so slightly to peer at his surroundings as his world spun. Two men in what he thought he recognized as Tartarus prison guard uniforms were washing away the blood that he had been soaked in. While he couldn't see or hear Kai right now, he could only imagine how he must be relieved that the filth coating him was finally getting removed. His eyes slipped closed again. He didn't bother to try and move on his own, painfully aware of how heavy his arm felt as one of the guards raised it to better clean his hand. Why the fuck did they not at least hose him down before all this shit dried? The other man snorted. They were a little more worried about him fighting off all the quirk suppressants like he was. They couldn't figure it out, so just ended up pumping him full of sedatives. The guy still took more than a 5 times lethal dose before he stopped waking up every 5 minutes. The man holding his hand paused in his scrubbing. Wait, should we be worried he might wake up then? The other snorted. All the more reason to clean him up faster. Still, they gave him a fresh dose of sleep-a-time right before we got him, so we should be fine for another 20 or so minutes. The man holding his hand readjusted his grip to flip the hand over. All 5 fingers brushed the man's wrist, and 𝐲𝐴 knew his quirk from feeling alone. Analysis related of some sort. Mental emitter class B. He reached out with his quirk alone to caress it, to turn it about to try and gather more data when the man recoiled with a yelp. What the fuck? What? I think he just tried to take my quirk in his fucking sleep. Rude. He was just looking. If he wanted to take it, he would have snagged it before he could have recoiled. Still, it was good to know that people could feel when he interacted with their quirks. Dumbass. His quirk is 5-point contact. It is probably just as reflexive to use as others. Just be careful to not let him touch you with all 5 fingers at once and you'll be fine. Right. Can I use my quirk on you real fast? Just to, check that he didn't actually snag it. Yeah, go for it. There was rustle of clothes before the nervous man gave a sigh of relief. Yeah, okay, it is still working. Though, you probably should have actually eaten something for breakfast this morning. Your blood sugar is sort of low. The calmer of the two snorted. I got a call to come in early to meet the transport he was on to scrub blood off of him. Why the fuck would I have eaten with that in mind? I'll eat after, when I have scrubbed myself with a shit ton of cleaner. Why didn't you just test your quirk on him anyways? Because if it was working just fine like it actually is, I would have gotten a massive headache if I had tried, so long as that IV line is in. I can't read his levels while a shit ton of stuff is being pumped into him without it glitching out my quirk. There is sort of a reason I didn't become a doctor despite the medical applications. Fair, I guess. As they lapsed back into silence, 𝐲𝐴 found himself oddly enjoying the feeling of them scrubbing away at his skin and began to massage his scalp as they worked the soap down to his roots to remove the blood that had been staining his white hair red. It didn't take long, but they were going for sanitary, not pretty obviously from how one of the men cursed as the comb he was using caught on one of the tangles that had come from his handling while his hair had been wet. The sudden sharp tug made his eyes snap open with a yelp, and for both men to immediately recoil with a pair of their own. I thought you said he would sleep through it. The guy has enough fucking sedatives in his system to kill a damn T-Rex. He fucking shouldn't be awake. 𝐲𝐴 struggled to raise a hand up to grab his head where the knot had pulled. His tongue felt like lead. 𝗧𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏 the hell do we do? It was about that time, as 𝐲𝐻 struggled to push himself up even with the power of One for All sparking over him, that he finally registered something pretty important. 𝐷𝗏𝐬 The pair were becoming more and more panicked as the door between them and perceived safety seemed to remain locked. 𝐲𝐻 just dazedly blinked at them before looking around the room proper. Clean pants. He vaguely registered them openly panic-sobbing and begging for mercy for just doing their jobs as he staggered up to his feet before turning and stumbling slightly to the cart of supplies they had been using to grab the clothes that had been sitting neatly on top. It took a bit of fumbling and nearly falling over twice, with the drugs obviously still in his system, leaving him feeling like a drunk baby giraffe, but now he had pants again. He was still leaning up against the cart when the door finally slid open and danger sense flared sluggishly again. It was obvious that he couldn't dodge as he heard the puff of an air compressor firing before he felt the prick of a needle in his neck. More annoyed than anything, he realized what just happened. He pulled it free and allowed gravity to pull him back down to the floor where he belonged. The world began to blur at the edges again as the feeling to his lower body just disappeared and his face began to go numb. 𝐲𝐸 blankly stared at the man who had shot him as he turned back to someone on the other side of the doorway. Clear. I don't think he was really properly awake yet for all the moving around and trying to talk he was doing. I'm pretty sure he probably would have tried to prioritize escape or stealing their quirks over pants of all things if he was. Given that he had a pretty fairly well-known reputation for having a sleep disorder of some sort, he might have just been sleepwalking. Or, well, he still is, I guess, even if he has another dose of full-body paralytic in him, since he still looks awake but pretty out of it. Slowly people began to file back into the room. 𝐲𝐸 quickly lost interest in them again as he fumbled internally for a quirk to neutralize the numbness but failed. It seemed that none of the Namu had poison resistance or immunity quirks for as many copies of cellular regeneration and shock absorption he now had. He would have to give a couple to Izuku the next time he saw him. His vision swam as he was bodily picked up and returned to the chair they had had him sitting in before. He tried to give a noise of protest as they forced him into a straitjacket before strapping him into the seat. There was the flash of a camera in the midst of it all before most of the men stepped away to clear a path between him and the door. He could only really helplessly sit as they wheeled him off down the halls and in and out of elevators. Down and down and down. His heart sank as he realized he was being carted down to the lowest levels of the prison, likely down to his father's old cell, one that had never been used before in this timeline. The hours, or perhaps it had only been minutes, passed in a dizzying haze after he had been left alone in his new cell. Slowly but surely he regained himself under the watch of 2 machine gun turrets. As he did, he came to several realizations. 1. The vestiges were not even trying to surface in the real world anymore. 2. He could only sense the life of 5 vestiges, meaning that, assuming the fight was well and truly over, 3 of his friends had died for good during that mess, either while he had been distracted fighting or while he had been drugged out of his mind. This was extremely concerning given he had no memory of turning on PvP in his quirk, so how it could have even happened was a freighting unknown. Had he accidentally allowed it in his distracted or drugged states? He could still sense their quirks, but 3. The ones who had died had been Katsumi, Toyami, and Nana. Their quirks now just a few in a sea of hundreds in his pool for All For One. Only found as easily as they had been because he was so familiar with Gearshift, Fa-Jin, and Float at this point that reaching for them was nearly as natural as erasure as All For One had always been for him. He cried. He cried proper Midoriya tears at the realization that they were just gone and there was no coming back from it. For what his poor uncle must be going through with the loss of his husband despite their recent issues, as well as his close friend. For his uncle, who had lost 3 of his successors in what had likely been a short span of time because 𝐲𝐸 had allowed it. He didn't blame the man for not wanting to talk with him anymore. He wondered how they died at the same time, deciding he truly did not want to know. If he knew, then all he would have done was try and imagine ways he could have prevented their second deaths. Finally, his mourning was disturbed as a few painfully familiar figures and one unfamiliar one appeared on the other side of the glass wall he had been sat facing. The look of pure loathing on Sir Night-Eye's face was just another knife stabbed into him and twisted. You can stop with the crocodile tears. 10. No more able to stop them now that they had started than he had in his old body. He just gave another sob. Nezu flicked his ears in a painfully familiar way of annoyance before turning to Sir. Have you perhaps considered that the tears are genuine? Some of the various sedatives he has been dosed with over the past 37 hours have been known to affect mood in some people upon wearing off. This is likely a stressful enough situation to warrant real ones, certainly. The mystery third figure, a woman he had never met before to his knowledge in either life, huffed and tapped her pen on her clipboard. Do you think he will stop anytime soon? We have a lot of questions to cover. Unless he obtained a water creation quirk, he will likely be forced to stop by his own biology soon enough when he starts to become dehydrated. Midoriya has never been much of a proper crier from what I have seen of him, so I don't expect him to last much longer. Nezu was of course not wrong as 𝐲𝐸 fought back his tears under control. Still, the tightness in his chest did not release as he continued to be held in a grip of what he was realizing to be a panic attack. He was still steadying his breathing when the woman cut in again. Midoriya 10 𝐲𝐸, are you capable of answering our questions now? 𝐲𝐸 gave a shaky nod. She just glanced down at her clipboard again. First, would you care to explain what that was all about? 𝐲𝐸 gave another shaky breath as his throat tightened again. Panic, attack, happens. Sometimes. Each word was painful to force out, even knowing that cooperation was his best bet here. The woman glanced over at the principal, who just nodded. He has a long record of suffering from such attacks whenever he comes out of a stressful situation, as the adrenaline wears off, likely due to his history of growing up largely on the streets. There was a brief period of time while he was still a student at UA when we tried to get him on some anti-anxiety medications which, while helping stop his panic attacks completely, left him suffering violent mood swings, which was frankly more dangerous for everyone involved. He was still mostly functional even during his attacks most of the time, so taking him back off the medication seemed to be the better alternative. All of this was in the medical records for him that Recovery Girl provided. That seemed to startle Sir. You're saying he has shown levels of aggression like that during the incident before? Yes and no. He obviously has never ripped apart another human being with his bare hands before, or I would never have allowed him to stay around children. He did bite Vlad King once hard enough to draw blood though. 𝐲𝐻 snorted. Can deserve that. The words came a bit easier now as he realized that even if he was on the other side of the glass, Netsu was still holding true to his self-proclaimed position of ally. He knew better to sneak up on me, and especially when I had just come straight to UA off a late patrol. I don't know what he was really expecting to happen. Sir gave him a look of disbelief. You were claiming that your gut reaction to someone throwing an arm around you is to bite them. 𝐲𝐻 shrugged as best he could in the jacket. It is a trauma response. It doesn't have to be logical. When I was younger, a guy with a 5-point decay quirk snuck up on me and threw his arm around me casually before grabbing my throat in a 4-point grip and threatened to lower the 5th if I tried anything. I eventually got away with outside assistance, but now if I am not expecting an arm around my shoulders, I instantly end up back in that moment and lash out. The woman looked up from her writing. And what happened to the guy in the end? Did you take his quirk? No, Dad did. I didn't know about having all for one myself until much later. Would it be possible for you to list all the quirks you have at your disposal, or should we just assume that is something that you don't intend to share? 𝐲𝐻 weighed the pros and cons in honesty. I can tell you the ones I for sure know about. I wasn't exactly paying much attention to what I was grabbing back the USJ, so unless you can give me some time to meditate on it, I can't give you an exact itemized list. I can tell you that I got well over 200 quirks from the fight alone, since none of the Namu had less than 4 quirks apiece and 6 had 2 at his own disposal. That being said, most of them are duplicates of one another from quirk copies that the doctor made. The number of shock absorption quirks alone is obscene, since almost all of them had it. Prior to the fight, I only had 11 quirks at my disposal, including all for one itself. The remaining 10 were Transference, Power Stockpile, Gear Shift, Font Jin, Danger Sense, Black Whip, Smokescreen, Float, Overhaul, and, of course, Erasure. Her glare when she looked back up at him seemed predatory. Oh, and who all did you steal all of those from? 𝐲𝐻 clicked his tongue. Literally only one of them is stolen. Erasure is just as much my quirk as All for One and was my first quirk to manifest as a kid. With the exception of Overhaul, all the rest were a package deal thanks to my late uncle that, for the sake of clarity for you, I'll refer to as One for All. When he was still alive, my dad gave him Power Stockpile, not realizing he already had Transference, and the two of them combined and were passed on to his husband, who had Gearshift, who passed it on, etc., until I got it through shenanigans. Overhaul originally belonged to a Yakuza member named Chisaki Kai, who has since apparently embraced his quirkless status and left the country to join the stupid Humorize cult. Shenanigans? You mean you stole it? 𝐲𝐻 gave Sir a frankly confused look at the actuation. Sir, you know the combination of quirks known as One for All can't be stolen. The ghost of my uncle left in the quirk has to approve of the transfer before it can happen. That earned him an odd look from the woman. Ah, yes, we heard from both Midnight and 13 that you claim your quirk is haunted. 𝐲𝐻 huffed. A quirk is more than just a power someone has. Every one of them, if removed from their original holder, carries an after-image of who the original person was. A ghost. That is how it is easy to distinguish an original version of a quirk from one of the doctor's copies. The copies contain no prior identity. That is one of the reasons that most people can't hold more than one quirk and not go batshit crazy, since in all likelihood, the new quirk and the old will fight with one another like an autoimmune response. It is possible that even copies might come with that risk. She didn't look like she fully believed him. And would we be able to ask these ghosts some questions? 𝐲𝐻 sighed and shook his head. Not currently. Normally I have to make an effort to tune them out to not get distracted, but currently they are tuning me out and hiding in the quirk in response to what happened. I can't exactly blame them for it either, since in taking all those quirks I broke my promise to them that I would not follow in my father's footsteps and start stealing quirks en masse like that. I didn't need them, but stealing them away was the only way I could actually destroy the doctor's monsters. The moment I stopped using Erasure on one, it would have regenerated like nothing happened. Monsters. Those villains were people. 𝐲𝐻 shook his head. No, they were living corpses. I know perfectly well what kind of bullshit mad science that the doctor has been up to thanks to my dad and 𝐸. There is a damn good reason even my father, who is fucking all for one, wants nothing to do with the man anymore. Even villains have lines in the sand that they do not cross, and the man danced right past my dad's decades ago. 𝐸𝐸𝐸. was slightly fuming when 𝐸𝗓𝗍 and the woman that he could only assume either worked in the prison or for the commission packed up to leave. It hadn't taken long for him to realize that nothing he was saying really mattered to the two of them. They had come into the interview with their minds made up about his guilt, and he could tell that Nedzu was just playing along with them to keep himself still in their good graces. Still, he was glad that his former employer had come along from the hints of news from the outside that he gave with carefully worded questions. Naomasa had been arrested for collaboration, likely due to the fact he had probably been at work at the station when the attack happened, but everyone else was safely on the run. Well, almost everyone, he supposed, given that the Bakugus had also been taken into custody under suspicion since they were family friends. A fact that amused 𝐲𝗏 at least a little. Maybe Kaken would learn something from the experience. But then again, maybe not. Nedzu, however, hung back in the doorway. If you were given a chance to do it all over again, would you? 𝐲𝗏 felt the corner of his mouth tick up in a smile, hearing the real question hidden in the question. Was this outcome really better than the last timeline? I would choose to do everything the same again in a heartbeat. Nedzu gave a small apologetic look before nodding and leaving 𝐲𝗏 alone again. The days that followed were hellish as he tried and failed repeatedly to reach out and one for all to try and talk with the ghosts, only to repeatedly fail as he would be shot for his attempt. The mounted guns programmed to fire if his energy reading changed even slightly in a way that could be interpreted as him using a quirk. It was frustrating as he failed to enter the quirk even in his sleep time and time again as he worried for his ghostly family. The fact he couldn't even talk to those that had survived somehow made the fact that 3 of them had died even worse, because right now he couldn't even mourn them properly. It was 19 awkward meals of being spoon-fed by a guard later that All Might himself finally appeared. The man was a wreck and clearly looked like he had stopped eating again, and likely had not been sleeping well either from how bad the bags under his eyes had gotten. I was wondering when you were finally going to visit. You look like shit. When was the last time you ate a proper meal? Or slept, for that matter? That made the man jolt slightly. What? 𝐲𝗏 huffed. Yagi, if I had wanted you dead I would have killed you ages ago. Now answer the question. He seemed to consider it as he bit his lip. I'm not really sure, and I got an hour's sleep on the ride over here. 𝐲𝗏 huffed. Just promise me that you will actually take a couple hours to take fucking care of yourself when you leave. Now you have a question for me, I assume. If what you claim about being from another timeline is true, why did you not seek me out if I was your ally in the last one? What made you so scared of me? Yagi, you can change the weather with a single punch, and in the last timeline brain my father just as badly as you did in this one. I know how merciless you are when it comes to the followers of All for One from the last go-round, and even before I knew about the actual connection between us, I was scared what would have happened had you jumped to the wrong conclusions at the realization I had multiple quirks. I woke up in the past with full access to 10 quirks. Something that was not true the last time, and it changed more than just my fragmentary future knowledge in regards to derailing a possible global disaster. My husband 𝗲𝗏 died last time when that building dropped. He only lived this time because I moved without thinking to save him with the aid of the quirks that came back with me. All might look taken aback at that, but you would have just been a child at the time from what I understand. Surely you didn't really think I would lash out like that against a literal child. Yagi, in the last timeline you nearly broke the backs of 2 first-year hero course students when their class final exam was changed to that of fighting the UA staff. Izuku had fucking nightmares about you attacking him that brutally for weeks that he never told you about because he was scared he would lose the closest thing he had to a father figure after our father seemingly ghosted our family because the brain damage you gave him made him forget his wife and son that he knew about. You nearly impaled him through the middle in that fight. Believe me, if you had still had your quirk by the time classes started back up after the break, you never would have been left alone with the students again. That was something that had come up over the months since Izuku had woken up after Izuku had asked how the man that he had turned his dorm room into a shrine for and he had so clearly loved like a father figure seemed to scare him so much. When the clusterfuck that had been his final exam had come up, Izuku had immediately snapped that had he had the chance to watch the fight live, he would have immediately stopped the test when he saw just how brutal that All Might was being. The man was supposed to have been pulling his punches for them since the weights that he wore like the other teachers were basically little more than decoration for him given his strength even powered down, but had very much not been. 𝐲𝐡𝐢 had been surprised to discover that his teacher had not known about the fact that 𝐾𝐻 had punched him before they started either, since recording of the fight he received did not have the footage from before the fight actually started, had been even more livid, since that would have been grounds enough for Bakugo to have failed the test outright and likely cleared up his own confusion to the nature of their relationship that had allowed them to be matched together at All Might's insistence in the first place. All Might, who had time and time again failed to read the signs of the abusive relationship that he and 𝐾𝐻 had had, and was the one largely responsible for the enabling of it, since the other teachers had trusted his knowledge on the fact sent. While he had never openly confirmed it, they knew he had at least known 𝐲𝐡𝐢 as Izuku prior to the start of the year. Focusing back in the moment, he reopened his eyes that he had closed to steady his breathing to find that All Might had froze in a horrified shock. Knowing he still had the floor, 𝐲𝐡𝐢 continued, "Your judgment is frankly not something I trust at this point. Not when you could repeatedly see the signs of abuse in your favorite student and force him into a fight with not only yourself but his abuser as well. Not when you yourself ruined any chance of my brother and I forming a relationship of trust by proving to a scared kid that teachers still were not to be trusted, which had been drilled into his head back before his quirk could manifest and he was thought to be quirkless. Yagi, if it wasn't for the fact that I know that you were doing that shit because you didn't fucking know better, I would have never even bothered trying to force myself to extend an olive branch to you in this timeline." 𝐲𝐡𝐢 was shaking when he stopped, but that was fine. That had been something that he had longed to say to the man, even if this one had not been the one to do it. To tell the man with the face of the one he had allowed to continually hurt him with his inability to understand what he really had needed in ignorance. All Might not have ever been malicious, but his frankly idiotic choices had hurt him just as much as the League had, if not more so. Why had he not just called Gran Torino from the start to help teach him, but waited until he broke his hand so badly that it was permanently twisted into a new form and would ache constantly in the background for the rest of that life? Why had he repeatedly allowed 𝐾𝐻 to do what he did to 𝐲𝐡𝐢 as Izuku, even after that first battle trial where he had fought to kill him? Why had he forced 𝐲𝐡𝐢 as Izuku to lie time and time again about the truth of his quirk to even his own mother? He loved the man. He really did, but the blinders had been ripped away by his new circumstances, and with time, he could hardly be so blind as to not see how bad for himself their relationship had ultimately been. Yes, there had been more good moments than bad, but the level of just how bad those bad moments and frankly toxic actions had eventually hit him like a truck, much like had been the case with 𝐾𝐻, even if the balance had been far more badly weighted to the other side for him. After sitting in silence for several minutes as he found himself in the midst of another panic attack, All Might eventually just silently staggered to his feet again and just left. That was the last time that 𝐲𝐡𝐢 would ever see him alive. Kai had just held out his hand in offering when the final body crashed into their roof and grabbed on. There was something fundamentally wrong with the vestige as it freely warped and twisted in and out of a human form. Deku summed up Yoichi's own thoughts on the matter almost immediately. "What the fuck is that?" The issue with Nana and Sensei was immediately tabled as real fear for all of their lives flooded Yoichi's system as the form above their heads briefly held a near reflection of his own face, framed in long dark hair split diagonally with a mass scar not too unlike 𝐵𝑖𝐽's had been. That was 6 overclock, and Yoichi had just killed the only one of them that had any hope of allowing them to match his speed. This was bad. 6 slammed his twisting form into the glass, shattering it before Kai had a chance to finish, dropping to the floor to use his quirk to reinforce it further. He vanished to reappear in Yoichi's own face with his hands locked around his throat as he began to squeeze just like Yoichi had just done to 𝐵𝑖𝐽. "Give me back 10. Oh, shit." For once he really wished that 𝐲𝐡𝐢 did not look so much like himself. Yoichi trashed in the other's grip as 6's grip tightened to the point Yoichi felt his own spine pop and numbness washed over his lower body. He couldn't breathe, couldn't even move anymore as his neck broke. He was dying. Except, Nana slammed into the monster with a snarl of protective fury, knocking Yoichi from his grip. As 6 turned and fought back, Yoichi had a sickening realization as he felt his injuries reverse themselves. 𝐲𝐡𝐢 had not changed his mind about the vestiges killing each other. Yoichi had succeeded because he had. Kai saw the moment things seemed to click for Shigaraki as he crouched beside him to help cover his healing by using his own quirk to accelerate it further. As the man had the same realization that he had the moment he had clarified that one for all was his quirk. 𝐲𝐡𝐢 was not the one in control in here. He was. He spoke lowly so that the others wouldn't hear over the scuffle between 6 and Nana. "How do you want to handle this, boss?" He looked slightly green as he cast a slightly broken glaze at the others around them. "Do your best to help the others besides Nana and Sensei." Kai nodded and sprung back up to his feet and quickly looked around to verify the situation. The abomination had thrown Shimura away to lay in a crumpled heap and was now locked in a fight with Banjo, who was using his quirk to hang onto the thing for dear life as it shot around the room, slamming him into the walls. To his shock, Sensei had used the distraction that the monster had provided to lash out at En, who Shinomori was desperately trying to save. Right, new priority. Kai slammed his hand down on the floor, sending up a wave of earthen spikes to impale Sensei and pin him to a wall away from his friend before rushing over to quickly reknit the older teen's clearly shattered right collar and shoulder. Are you two all right? Shinomori was looking over at Sensei with a look of clear horror. Why would he do that? And reached out with his left arm to shove him. Focus on 6 and freak out later. He turned to look back at Kai. Thank you for helping. Kai gave him a confused look. Why wouldn't I? You're my friend. That earned him a soft smile from the other teen. Glad to hear. Is Yoichi okay? Kai gestured over to the boss, who had leapt into the fray himself to assist Banjo in strangling the life out of the shifting form. He's fine, and stiffened slightly as he spotted Shimura's still form. Nana, Kai sighed as he noted the blurring edges of her form. It's probably better this way for her. She wanted to die, remember? At least this way she bought enough time for Banjo to grab that thing. And still fought back tears. I know. It still doesn't feel right though. Ei. Banjo Degoro was a simple man. He knew what he liked and had no qualms about doing the hard things when necessary. He was an underground hero. The underground hero, since the system would not have even existed if he hadn't gotten so pissed off at the limelight one to start moonlighting as a vigilante to actually fucking help people as he had wanted to do from the start. He loved a good fight and admittedly had made a few mistakes over his career that taught him a lot about what was and wasn't enough force to kill someone. The point was that Yoichi should have been dead. He wasn't, thank God, but the fact remained that his neck had been snapped just as he had done to his ex just minutes before. Now, under normal circumstances, he would have assumed it was just the place's normal quick healing bullshit, but when Nana had died just moments later, it was clear that should not have been the case. So either 𝐲𝐸 could be a lot more precise about the whole allowing to die thing than they thought and had only refrained from switching off their normal protection for him alone, or, more likely, Yoichi was full of shit and was the one who had been in control over who lived and died the whole time and had just been playing along with the narrative of 𝐲𝐸 being the one in control, since it meant that it was 𝐲𝐸 that had killed Yagi and not himself. Yagi, the man that 𝐲𝐸 had looked up to as another father, who had died immediately after 𝐲𝐸 had been left as a small child, a role that he couldn't help but notice that Yoichi had been quick to step in to fill. As much as the man would deny it, he shared a lot in common with his crazy brother. Possessiveness was very clearly a shared Shigaraki family trait that both 𝐲𝐸 and his brothers had shown in spades as well. Yoichi was also obviously just as vicious and could be as cruel too without batting an eye, as proven by some of the suggestions he threw out over the past several years about what they should do when they finally caught the doctor. The fact that he himself was healing as the monster tangled up in his quirk repeatedly bludgeoned him sort of proved it. He was fine because he had sided with Yoichi and wanted to keep 𝐲𝐸 safe. Nana had wanted to die, so he had allowed it. Fine, he could accept that. Second had been a threat to frankly all of them that was only able to hang on so long because Yoichi had loved him, but the moment that thread of connection tethering him to safety broke because of their relationship falling apart, it had only been a matter of time before something had to give. What he couldn't so readily accept was the fact that the man was clearly in fucking denial that he was the one really in control here. He could have ended this a while ago, but was pretending he was just like the rest of them. First, get your fucking act together and kill this bastard already. Yoichi stumbled in his attempted attack before looking up to meet Degoro's gaze before a look of resignation flashed over him. He stopped for a second before Degoro felt a tug at his core, much the same as when 𝐲𝐸 called upon Blackwhip, before he just exploded forward like a shot to wrap his own tendrils around 6 and latched on as Degoro's fell away, gone from his own control. Before he could even hit the ground, Yoichi had pivoted to drive a powerful punch down to crack 6's warping skull like an egg, much like All Might had done to his own brother. As the newly created corpse began to blur at the edges, Degoro felt as his quirk snapped back into place. Yoichi, looking rather sick, stumbled off and Degoro had to catch him to keep him from face planting. Both 𝐬𝐡𝐻 and 𝐸 were staring at him like he had grown a second head, clearly showing that he and Kai had been the only ones to realize what the hell was up. Still, 𝐸, as someone always good about rolling with the punches, rolled his shoulder before meeting his gaze. So you can use our quirks too. How long have you known you could do that? Yoichi winced but nodded. Yeah. He averted his eyes and scratched the back of his head. I didn't know for sure I could do it until just then. I've not wanted to try before. 𝐬𝐻, who had resumed staring at the corpse of third who Kai had pinned to the wall like a butterfly, spoke in a low flat tone. 𝐲𝐸 wasn't the one to change his mind, was he? Yoichi refused to look at any of them. No, he wasn't. Kai shoved his hands into his pockets and shook his head. I don't know why all of you are acting so surprised about this. The moment I heard that this was his quirk and not just something from one of the vestigeless ones, I figured it out. And sighed and shook his head. It is less a case of surprise about the fact itself but the implication. Setting aside Nana, given that she asked for it in both second and third for their hostility. That still leaves Yagi and the mystery of if it really was 𝐲𝐸 who truly ended him. Yoichi already with some power over Yagi's quirk due to the nature of his own, or if it had been an act of suicide on his part rather than have to deal with all of this. Degoro winced. That last one had not been one of the things that he had considered. Not with how much Yagi loved 𝐲𝐻𝐬 as Izuku. That he would have allowed the boy to do that to him in his panicked state despite how badly it would have hurt the kid had he remembered it. If Yoichi had looked ill before, it had nothing on how he looked now. When he spoke his voice cracked. It was me. I think that it was always me. 𝐲𝐻𝐬 did not combine the two quirks. My brother did back when he gave it to me. That was why it never had a true vestige. It was because it already did. The only reason it had been separated from me before Yagi was destroyed was because I was actively rejecting it as part of myself, but the shock of it being destroyed caused me to reabsorb it. Deku felt slightly sick now himself at the implications of the shit going on with Yoichi's head if he had allowed himself to literally develop a split personality that he later allowed to be fucking murdered. Shit, Yoichi, do you want a hug? Because I sure as shit think you probably need one. He jolted slightly before snapping his head around to look at Deku. His eyes red as he seemed to be fighting back tears. You're not afraid of me? After everything I have done? About everything I could do to you? He firmly shook his head. Nah, I know that you never would have allowed things to escalate this far if you could have helped it. Besides, we weren't holding 𝐲𝐻𝐬 accountable for the same shit that has you so worried, so I don't know why you would think we wouldn't do the same with you. The man just folded at that simple statement of fact. As Deku wrapped him up in a tight hug, he couldn't help but note that this was the first time he had ever personally seen the man break down like this. It left him wondering when the last time the man had allowed himself to do so, to process his own emotions. He had been acting as a grounding force for all of them for decades, hadn't he? Walling off his own thoughts and feelings on matters to better help the rest of them, clearly bottling up his own despair more and more as time passed. Had he been able to work through his own feelings at any point since his own death? From 𝐬𝐻𝐬's own confused, sad looks he was giving the man, he had to wonder if the man had even allowed himself to break down like this when it had just been him and second, especially given how toxic their relationship had clearly been from how they had always acted around one another, even if Deku had only really noticed when the pair had started more openly fighting. Well, at least this was a problem he could probably handle. Okay, new rule. You are no longer allowed to bottle up your feelings. If you need to cry, then you are allowed to fucking cry. If you need to scream, then fucking scream. What you have been doing isn't fucking healthy and can clearly get us all killed, so it has to stop. If nothing else, then consider doing it for 𝐲𝐻𝐬, because frankly I think he might have been following your lead for developing his shitty coping methods. Do you think you can do that for us? Yoichi, still sobbing hard into his shoulder, nodded. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. 𝐸𝐸𝐸𝐸. Crying for the better part of an hour was fairly cathartic. Realizing at the end of said hour that none of them could manifest in the outside world was less so. Not even Yoichi himself could. That had been concerning at first, but it was nearly a day later that he was able to catch a glimpse of the outside world again through 𝐲𝐻𝐬's eyes. They were in Tartarus. 𝐲𝐻𝐬 had been caught while they had been distracted. With the guns trained on 𝐲𝐻𝐬 set to shoot at the first sign of quirk use, Yoichi made the executive decision that they were staying inside the quirk for now, especially with how the turrets had reacted to him even trying to catch a glimpse through 𝐲𝐻𝐬's eyes. So they would just have to wait for his brother and the others to break 𝐲𝐻𝐬 out. It was like the vault all over again, but somehow even worse. At least this time he wasn't alone. 𝐸𝐸𝐸𝐸. Yoichi was beginning to really worry. It had been nearly a month since his brother had appeared in the vault that he had trapped Yoichi in. He was not necessarily worried about his brother himself, but the fact that even with him probably eating less food than he should have been every day, he was still starting to run dangerously low on food. His brother could hardly be mad about his periodic hunger strikes again when he did finally reappear, given he would have been out of food completely a week ago otherwise. Well, out of everything except white rice, since the 2 kilograms bag had basically been brand new when his brother left. As it was, he was down to the last of the frozen meals and cans of non-perishables. Damn, he was going to have to eat plain white rice, wasn't he? Yoichi had been still inventorying his meager collection of food to figure how much further he could forcibly stretch it when a familiar knock rang out on the door, had him leaping to his feet to greet the asshole that called himself his older brother. As the door swung open, Yoichi couldn't help but think his brother looked the tiniest bit more unhinged than normal, even for him lately. Sorry I took so long. Shopping is a bit harder to do right now with the war going on. Yoichi ignored his clear lie in favor of snatching one of the bags he carried and rooting through it. There was no point in trying to run past his brother with the door open so long as he stood in the doorway itself. All that would accomplish was his brother bodily picking him up and clinging to him for an extra hour. No thanks. I was worried I was going to have to start eating the rice by itself. His brother did wince at that. I'm sorry for that, little brother. I hadn't realized how long it had been since my last visit after I got a bit sidetracked. He kicked the door closed behind him and used a new quirk to lock it with just a hand gesture before walking over to set the rest of the bags in the kitchenette. My new ally is a doctor who thinks he has found a possible solution to help with your heart condition, an artificial meta ability that he manufactured just for you. Yoichi grimaced. I told you I don't want you to give me one of your meta powers. His brother scoffed. Yes, you have said that, but your argument against it has always been that you don't want one of the ones I stole from someone, as if most of them aren't freely given. You can't use that argument here since the only one who has ever held it is me. Yoichi huffed and turned to lean back against the counter to glare at his brother with his arms crossed. I am still not allowing you to play God with my body just because you think you might have a solution. You know what would also help my fucking heart condition? Being able to go fucking outside or even working out regularly. The slight twitch at the corner of his brother's eye was all the warning he got before his brother lunged forward to grab his face with enough force that he found himself crashing to a kneeling position on the floor. There was a horrible burning that made him scream out in pain before his brother released him to crouch down in front of him with a coup. There, all done. In a couple days I expect you will feel much better than you ever have before. Yoichi clasped his head as his world spun. What the fuck did you just do to me? I gave you a general power stockpiler. With time, you will only increase in strength as will your heart. In a couple years, I expect your heart condition will just be a distant memory. Years later, long after his new husband and husband's best friend had broken him free from his prison, Yoichi was mad that his brother had been right. Before, he would have struggled to lift more than a few kilograms at once, but now he could pick up and carry his husband no problem. And he couldn't even say that his new workout routine, courtesy of his status as a vigilante-turned-hero, had much to do with it, since he mainly acted as the guy in the chair for the seven due to being the least athletic and most tech-savvy of the group. And, he supposed, the best at analyzing meta abilities. He wanted to say the last part was something he had always been good at thanks to his love of retro hero comics. But that would be a lie. Honestly, his brother's fascinations with the powers in the comics and eventually in real life after he discovered the nature of his own meta ability had honed his brother's skill in the area. And he himself had likely learned the how to from pure repeat exposure. That wasn't to say he was not interested in them. Frankly, if anything, his interest in them had only grown, if only because the fun of puzzling the ins and outs of a meta ability scratched an itch at the back of his brain that hated mysteries. Still, he hated how the others sometimes reacted when he found himself off on a meta ability related tangent. How even his husband seemed unnerved by one of the few things he shared in common with his brother. How on the odd occasion that he crossed paths with his brother the man lit up when he did. How his brother would smile and use it as proof that they were not so different after all. He hated it. Hated the monster his brother had become. Hated that despite that fact he couldn't stop loving the man. Hated how despite everything he had done to him, the monster now going by all for one was still his brother. Hated that he could see himself in a twisted reflection in the man. Shigaraki Hasashi was long dead in his eyes. The thing that was left in his place only a mockery of his only blood family. A creature more obsessed with possession, like the stories of a dragon hoarding gold, than that of understanding real love. It didn't make him love his brother any less. Hasashi, of course, realized he knew how to fix the issue of his precious little Izuku's quirk status issue the moment he had confirmation from Garaki that his son did actually lack a quirk factor, unlike his brother had all those years ago. He had learned his lesson from that experience, that his own quirk could not be trusted to tell him if someone had a quirk or not when it came to his own blood, so had the good doctor fully map his son's genetic code to check. Izuku had all the pieces in place to have been born with his own copy of all for one except for two, the mutation needed for the actual ability to give and take quirks and a quirk factor to switch it all on. It was an easy enough fix. He just needed Garaki to make a copy of his own base quirk to patch the holes. Unfortunately, that had been easier said than done. As Garaki often bemoaned, his own quirk left him genetically unstable. Trying to figure out the genes responsible for his own quirk was evidently a nightmare to unravel. It was frankly unsurprising that his own son had a broken quirk as a result. So, as the process of recreating his own quirk dragged on and on, he found himself wondering if there was possibly another way to help patch his son's quirk. One that would solve the issue so he wouldn't have to give his son a quirk to act as a stopgap before he grew too old to believably manifest his quirk on his own. One for All was passed down by genetic transfer from what he understood. That meant that every holder of One for All likely carried his brother's genes hidden in their own. That they carried the missing pieces of the puzzle without the corrupted data acting as interference. Unfortunately, that didn't fix much even if it was true. Hasashi had been relentlessly pursuing One for All since his brother's death, and there was no chance he would get it willingly from its current holder. Still, he did not technically need to steal it if he could get a good enough DNA sample. Unfortunately, that was still not an easy prospect. To obtain the amount of blood that the doctor would need to recreate a copy of One for All was not something he would be able to do subtly. Not without knowing All Might's civilian identity. Not when even knowing it. It was unlikely that Garaki would be able to get that close even as one of the best doctors in the country under his current alias of Yujiko Daruma, given that he suspected Recovery Girl was acting as the man's primary physician. So, given that it was unlikely that he could successfully engineer a scenario in which All Might would choose to pass one for all onto Izuku directly any more than his attempts to arrange such a thing with previous holders had worked out, he would have to get the blood sample the old-fashioned way. He gave both 𝐀𝐻 and his precious Izuku hugs and kisses goodbye with the story of having a job to take care of overseas. With a final wave goodbye, he closed the door on that chapter of his life. Nearly 7 years later, he would regret that decision as the sight of his then 9-year-old but now nearly 17-year-old son lay dead in the arms of his teacher, who met his eyes in the wake of his memories being restored, as he sent the hero back with the sole instruction to prevent himself from leaving his family no matter the cost. He gave a sad chuckle as he had a realization as the timeline began to fall apart. It seemed that he had succeeded in his goal after all. Izuku had become the 9th, and without seemingly realizing it had gotten his own quirk after all. After all, Izuku never would have manifested the quirks of the other holders without it.